My name is Tobias Wright. I am 69 years old, and I spent 40 years building an empire in the shadows so my family would never know the sting of poverty or disrespect. But last Saturday at my granddaughter Lily's 7th birthday party, my daughter's father-in-law shoved a fistful of chocolate cake directly into my daughter's face. Her husband just stood there and laughed, telling her not to be so dramatic. I did not yell. I did not throw a single punch. I simply stood up, wiped her face, and made one phone call. By Monday morning, their entire world would begin to collapse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that true power never needs to shout. Growing up, I learned early on that a loud man is a weak man. I started out as a plumber in the late 70s, fixing leaky pipes and broken boilers in rundown commercial buildings across the city. What nobody knew, not even my own daughter, was that I bought those abandoned lots one by one. Over the decades, I built a private commercial real estate trust worth tens of millions of dollars. I kept my wealth entirely hidden. I wore faded flannel shirts, drove a 10-year-old pickup truck, and lived off what looked like a modest pension. I wanted my daughter, Camille, to value hard work, character, and integrity, not a trust fund. I promised my late wife, Sylvia, that our wealth would be a shield for Camille, used only when absolutely necessary. I never imagined I would need to turn that shield into a weapon against her own husband. The birthday party was held at the Lawson family estate, a sprawling, obnoxious mansion with manicured hedges and a driveway packed with imported luxury cars. Gerald Lawson, Brad's father, was a man who inherited his wealth and carried his prejudices behind polite country club smiles and backhanded compliments. He always looked at me like I was there to fix the sink. Brad, his son, and Camille's husband, was the CEO of a flashy tech startup. He was arrogant, entitled, and completely dependent on his father's old money connections to keep his failing business afloat. The tension had been brewing all afternoon. Despite it being Lily's birthday, Camille was treated like the hired help in her own home. She ran around organizing the caterers, calming down Lily's energetic friends, and ensuring Gerald's high society guests had their champagne glasses constantly refilled. No one offered to help her. Brad stood by the pool with his friends holding a craft beer and completely ignoring his wife's exhaustion. When it was finally time for the cake, Lily was beaming. Camille carefully carried the expensive 3-tier chocolate cake out to the patio table, singing "Happy Birthday." The guests gathered around. Gerald, holding his 3rd glass of scotch, stepped forward. He had been making snide remarks all day about how Camille was always trying too hard to fit in with their kind of people, how she lacked the natural grace of his side of the family. As Camille leaned in to help Lily blow out the candles, Gerald smirked. He muttered something under his breath about her needing to sweeten up her attitude. Then, in front of 50 wealthy guests, he slammed his heavy hand into the top tier of the cake and shoved a massive handful of frosting and sponge cake right into Camille's face. The entire patio fell dead silent. The music seemed to stop. I saw the absolute shock in Camille's wide eyes as the dark, sticky frosting slid down her cheeks, staining her elegant white dress and matting her hair. Lily let out a small, confused cry, terrified by the sudden violence. I looked immediately at Brad, hoping that he would step up and defend his wife against his father's horrific behavior. Instead, Brad let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He actually patted his father on the back. "Thanks, Pop." Brad chuckled loudly, looking around at his friends for approval. Maybe that will teach her not to be so dramatic all the time. My jaw locked. The sheer disrespect, the absolute lack of basic human decency radiated through my bones. Decades of intense discipline were the only thing that kept my hands firmly at my sides. A younger Tobias, the man who used to haul steel pipes for a living, might have broken Gerald's jaw right then and there. But I knew that physical violence was a poor man's revenge. True destruction is silent, surgical, and permanent. I stepped forward, moving with a calm certainty that parted the crowd. The wealthy guests stepped aside, their eyes full of a sickening mixture of pity and disdain for the old working-class father stepping up to comfort his humiliated daughter. I picked up a clean linen napkin from the catering table. I walked right up to Camille, ignoring Gerald's smug grin and Brad's lingering laughter. I gently wiped the thick cake and frosting from Camille's eyes and cheeks. She was trembling, holding back tears of profound shame. I looked at Brad, whose smirk faltered for a fraction of a second when he met my cold gaze. I did not say a word to him. I simply reached down and took Lily's small, sticky hand. "We are leaving," I said quietly to Camille. She did not argue. She did not look at her husband. She took Lily's other hand and we walked down that long, pristine driveway without looking back. Behind us, I could hear Gerald making a joke about us having no sense of humor, but the sound faded as we reached my old truck. As soon as Camille and Lily were safely secured inside the cab, I walked around to the driver's side and pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I rarely used outside of business hours. It belonged to Jonathan Pierce, my lead corporate attorney and the ruthless manager of my real estate trust. Jonathan answered on the second ring. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wright." I kept my voice perfectly level, void of any emotion. "Jonathan, I said I want you to look up Commercial Property Unit 4 in the downtown financial district. The lease for a tech startup registered under the name Brad Lawson." There was a brief pause as Jonathan typed on his end. "Yes," Tobias Jonathan replied smoothly. "I see it here. They are currently renting month to month after their initial 2-year term expired last month. Revoke it," I ordered. "Trigger the immediate repossession clause. No 30-day grace period. Have the property management team lock the glass doors, disable their key cards, and post the official eviction notice by dawn on Monday. Consider it done." "Mr. Wright," Jonathan said, asking absolutely no questions. I hung up the phone and started the engine. Camille was crying silently in the passenger seat, the remnants of the humiliation still clinging to her skin. She kept apologizing to me, telling me she was trying so hard to make the marriage work for Lily's sake that she thought she could endure Gerald's behavior if it meant her daughter had a stable home. I just reached over, held her hand, and told her she would never have to apologize to those people ever again. They had mistaken our quiet endurance for weakness. They had mistaken my faded clothes for a lack of power. Brad thought he had married the vulnerable daughter of a broke blue-collar worker. He thought his family could humiliate us without consequence because we relied on them. But he had no idea who he had really crossed. When Monday morning rolled around, Brad was going to wake up to a brutal reality check. He was going to pull his imported sports car up to his shiny glass office building, the absolute pride and joy of his tech CEO persona, and find an iron padlock on the door. He was about to learn that the very ground he built his arrogant life upon belonged to the man he had just laughed at. Monday morning arrived with a brutal wake-up call for Brad Lawson. At 7 in the morning, he pulled his leased sports car into the private garage of the downtown financial district. He strutted up to the sleek glass double doors of his tech startup holding his artisanal coffee, ready to bark orders at his interns. Instead, he found a thick steel chain looped tightly through the door handles, secured by a heavy industrial padlock. Taped squarely at eye level was a bright yellow legal notice of immediate eviction. The management company had seized the premises due to lease violations effective immediately. Brad dropped his coffee, the hot liquid splattering across the polished concrete floor. He yanked on the locked doors frantically, his face turning crimson as a crowd of his own employees gathered behind him in confused whispers. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling with rage, and dialed the property management office. A polite, automated voice informed him that his month-to-month tenancy had been terminated at the owner's discretion, and all assets inside the office were temporarily frozen pending a thorough audit. Panic gripped his chest. His primary investors were scheduled for a massive presentation tour on Wednesday. He needed an office. He needed his servers. Unable to fix the problem, he dialed his wife, ready to unleash his absolute fury on the easiest target he knew. Back at my modest home, Camille was sitting at my kitchen table, staring blankly at a cold cup of tea. We had spent the entire Sunday talking about the harsh realities of her marriage. She confessed things she had hidden from me for 5 years, just to protect my pride. She told me about the ironclad prenuptial agreement Brad and Gerald had forced her to sign a mere week before the wedding. It was a brutal, manipulative contract designed specifically to ensure she walked away with absolutely nothing if the marriage ever dissolved. Brad had convinced her it was just a corporate formality to appease his startup investors, but in reality it was a chokehold. He controlled every single dollar in their household, intensely scrutinizing her grocery receipts while he blew thousands on weekend golf trips with his buddies. She had traded her own promising career in graphic design to be his unpaid assistant, his event planner, and a full-time mother, sacrificing her entire financial independence to build his grand illusion of a perfectly successful life. The front door of my house burst open just before noon. Brad stormed into my living room without bothering to knock, his face flushed and his expensive designer suit wrinkled. He looked like a man whose perfectly curated reality was rapidly collapsing around him. He completely ignored my presence, marching straight toward Camille with a wild look in his eyes. He pointed a shaking finger at her face. He told her his company had been illegally locked out of their headquarters. His servers, his prototypes, and his crucial investor presentations were all trapped behind a steel chain. He demanded $50,000 in cash by the end of the day to secure a temporary luxury co-working space and hire a high-profile crisis lawyer. Then, with a level of audacity that almost impressed me, Brad looked around my worn living room and demanded that she make herself useful for once. He told Camille to ask me to cash out my plumber's pension. He suggested I take out a second mortgage on my house to save his company. He actually stood in my home breathing heavily and told my daughter that since she had embarrassed his family at the party on Saturday, she owed him this massive favor to fix his bad luck. He called my life savings a measly retirement fund that was doing nothing but collecting dust and stated it was the least I could do to support a real businessman like him. He promised he would pay me back eventually, maybe with a minor fraction of his company's stock once it went public. He ranted about how her negative energy had cursed his week and how it was her duty as a wife to fix this disaster. Every word he spoke dripped with pure entitlement. He truly believed we existed solely to absorb his failures and fund his arrogant ambitions. I stood quietly by the kitchen counter, my face a mask of absolute calm, watching this pathetic display. I looked at Camille. For the first time in her marriage, she did not shrink away from his anger. The deep humiliation of the cake incident combined with his absurd demand to drain my retirement savings had finally broken his psychological spell over her. She looked at the man she had loved, the father of her child, and saw him for exactly what he really was, a desperate, greedy bully hiding behind his father's money. I placed a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. She nodded, understanding perfectly. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry, argue, or throw a fit to match his hysteria. She simply stood up, grabbed her car keys, and drove straight back to the Lawson estate. She walked through that massive mansion in total, calculated silence. She pulled 2 suitcases from the closet and packed only what truly mattered. She took Lily's clothes, her favorite books, and her own basic necessities. She deliberately left behind the diamond necklaces, the designer handbags, and every single expensive gift Brad had ever bought to parade her around his country club friends. She took off her wedding ring and placed it perfectly in the center of his nightstand. She packed exactly what she had brought into that toxic marriage, nothing more. When Brad arrived at the estate an hour later, still shouting into his phone about suing his landlord, Camille walked right past him in the hallway. She loaded the suitcases into her modest sedan, strapped Lily securely into her car seat, and drove away without saying a single goodbye. By 3 p.m, Brad finally realized she was not coming back to apologize or beg for his forgiveness. His massive ego, already fractured by the sudden eviction, shattered completely. He retaliated the only way a coward knows how. Camille was standing in the local grocery store aisle trying to buy some fruit and snacks for Lily when the cashier handed back her debit card stating it had been declined. Brad had logged into their accounts and frozen every single credit card and joint checking account attached to her name. He drained the balances, leaving her with 0 available funds to feed her child. Then my daughter's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was a photo from Brad showing a drafted legal petition from his family's lawyer. The text beneath the photo read loudly and clearly, "You have no money, no job, and no house. I am filing for full emergency custody of Lily tomorrow morning. Good luck proving to a judge that a homeless, penniless woman is a fit mother." Camille stood completely frozen in the grocery store checkout lane. The cashier tapped the card reader with a perfectly polite but impatient sigh, declaring the transaction declined for the 3rd consecutive time. A long line of busy shoppers grumbled behind them, shifting their weight and checking their watches. Camille looked down at Lily, who was happily clutching a small plastic box of strawberries, completely unaware that her father had just financially orphaned them with a single petty keystroke. Camille felt the intense heat of shame rise in her cheeks, a familiar burning sensation that Brad loved to inflict. But this time she refused to let it break her. She politely apologized to the cashier, left the groceries sitting on the conveyor belt, and walked out the automatic sliding doors with her head held high. When she arrived back at my house, her face was pale and her hands shook slightly as she showed me the malicious text message from Brad. He had weaponized his inherited wealth exactly as he always did, assuming she would come crawling back to his mansion by nightfall just to feed her own child. He thought stripping away her access to basic survival funds would guarantee her immediate surrender. He was horribly wrong. I poured her a glass of cold water, took her phone, and placed it face down on my kitchen counter. The era of Brad Lawson pulling the strings had officially ended. Watching my daughter try to hold back her tears, my mind drifted to a solemn promise I made 20 years ago. My late wife Sylvia had always possessed a razor-sharp intuition about people and power dynamics. When our real estate trust began generating its first serious millions, she made me swear to keep it completely hidden from the world. Sylvia knew that visible wealth attracted vultures, men who would view our daughter as a lucrative corporate acquisition rather than an equal partner. We chose to live quietly in this modest single-story house in a working-class neighborhood so Camille would attract someone who loved her for her character. As an older black man who had spent his youth fixing pipes in the mud, I knew society was already primed to underestimate me. I used their blind prejudice as my greatest camouflage. Sylvia made me promise that if a predator ever slipped through our carefully crafted defenses, I would unleash the absolute full weight of our hidden resources to crush them. I looked around my kitchen with its faded wallpaper and scuffed linoleum floors. Brad and his father thought they were bullying a defenseless aging plumber living on a fixed government income. Early Tuesday morning, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled up to the cracked curb right in front of my house. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out carrying an expensive leather briefcase. He walked up my narrow driveway, his nose visibly wrinkled in obvious disgust as he carefully sidestepped a small puddle near my porch. It was Stephen Hayes, a senior partner at the most ruthless family law firm in the city, frequently employed by Gerald Lawson to clean up his personal and corporate messes. I opened the door before he could even knock. Stephen did not bother to introduce himself properly. He stepped right into my living room, glancing at my worn fabric recliner and the old television set with a smirk of deep, unmistakable condescension. Camille stepped out of the hallway, holding Lily close to her leg. Stephen cleared his throat and announced in a booming theatrical voice that he represented Brad and Gerald Lawson. He stated plainly that the Lawson family was prepared to drag Camille through a horrific, drawn-out custody battle that would completely destroy her reputation in the city. He emphasized that Brad had limitless resources while Camille was currently unemployed, entirely broke, and residing in a dilapidated property fundamentally unsuitable for a child of Lily's high society pedigree. Then Stephen popped open the gold clasps of his briefcase. He pulled out a crisp, certified cashier's check and placed it aggressively on my dining table. He told Camille that Gerald Lawson was a highly reasonable man who preferred to avoid messy public scandals. The check was for exactly $10,000. Stephen explained it was a generous relocation fund. All Camille had to do was sign the attached legal waiver granting Brad full physical and legal custody of Lily, and she could take the money to start a new life somewhere far away from their elite circles. Stephen actually chuckled, looking around my humble home, adding that $10,000 was probably more cash than I had seen in a decade. He suggested she take the deal immediately before Brad decided to leave her with absolutely nothing and a mountain of outstanding legal fees she could never hope to pay. He stood there in my home, radiating absolute arrogance, waiting for the poor, desperate woman to grab the pathetic lifeline he had just tossed into the mud. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults at the lawyer standing in my living room. I simply walked over to the dining table and picked up the $10,000 check. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with Stephen Hayes as I walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder I kept by my small wooden desk. I fed the check directly into the machine. The loud mechanical grinding noise filled the silence of the room, instantly reducing Gerald Lawson's insulting bribe to worthless paper confetti. Stephen's smug smile vanished in a second, replaced by a look of sheer, sputtering confusion. I pointed a steady finger at my front door and told him to get off my property before I had him arrested for criminal trespassing. He grabbed his briefcase and hurried out to his luxury car, clearly shocked that the old plumber did not drop to his knees and beg for his handouts. As soon as his car sped around the corner, I grabbed my coat and told Camille to get her purse. We drove straight to a private wealth management branch in the financial district, a discreet bank exclusively reserved for high-net-worth clients. The branch manager greeted me by my first name, immediately ushering us past the regular tellers into a soundproof VIP office. I had Camille hand over her identification to open a brand new, highly secure account solely in her name. I then authorized a direct, untraceable wire transfer from one of my oldest holding companies. I deposited exactly $500,000 in liquid cash into my daughter's new account. I handed her the sleek, heavy metal debit card. She looked at the account balance on the printed bank receipt, her breath catching in her throat as she realized she was instantly more financially secure than Brad had ever been in his entire life. The trap was beautifully set, but Brad's absolute paranoia accelerated the timeline perfectly. Still locked out of his office building and frantic for operational capital, Brad had been obsessively running background checks and illegally monitoring Camille's social security number through a shady private investigator he kept on retainer. The exact moment the massive $500,000 deposit registered under Camille's name, a red flag triggered in Brad's surveillance network. Blinded by his own financial panic and massive ego, Brad jumped to the most convenient delusional conclusion possible. He convinced himself that Camille had somehow hacked into his startup's frozen corporate accounts and stolen his investment capital right before the landlord evicted him. Enraged and desperate to reclaim the funds he genuinely thought were his, Brad picked up his phone and dialed the local police department. He officially reported his wife for grand larceny and corporate embezzlement, demanding that officers be dispatched to my house for her immediate arrest. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the peeling paint of my front porch before the sirens even cut off completely. 2 heavy squad cars rolled to a harsh stop against the curb of my quiet street, their tires crunching loudly against the gravel. I stood at the living room window watching the heavy doors swing open. 4 uniformed police officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts as they assessed my property. And right behind them, pulling up in an expensive luxury sedan he was undoubtedly weeks behind on paying for, was Brad. He stepped out of his car with a sickeningly triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He actually adjusted his designer tie, acting as if he were arriving at a red carpet premiere rather than orchestrating the arrest of his own wife. Neighbors began peeking through their blinds and stepping out onto their lawns, drawn by the spectacle. Camille gripped my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve as she watched her husband coordinate with the police on my front yard. He was pointing directly at my front door, playing the role of the devastated, betrayed tech executive to absolute perfection. I gently patted Camille's hand, feeling the rapid, terrified pulse of her heartbeat through her skin. I told her to breathe deeply and step back into the hallway out of sight. Standing there, watching Brad spin his desperate web of lies to armed officers, I was reminded of my early days working as an independent plumber in the late 1980s. Back then, arrogant commercial contractors would constantly try to shortchange me, assuming a young black man working with his hands would not have the intelligence or resources to fight back in a corporate boardroom. They would falsify invoices, claim I never delivered on my contracts, and threaten legal action to avoid paying me for my sweat. That was when I learned the ultimate power of meticulous, undeniable paperwork. My late wife, Sylvia, helped me build a habit of documenting every single penny that went in and out of my hands, a strict habit that carried over into the creation of my real estate trust. I structured my wealth to be completely bulletproof against any audit, investigation, or hostile corporate takeover. Brad was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating his targets. You cannot outsmart a man who has spent 40 years anticipating the treachery of greedy men. The heavy, authoritative knock on my front door echoed loudly through the small house. I opened it calmly, keeping my posture relaxed and my hands visible. A tall, stern-looking officer stepped forward, keeping a hand resting near his radio. He asked for Camille Lawson, stating loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear that they were executing an active arrest warrant for grand larceny and corporate embezzlement. Brad pushed his way past the officers standing on my worn welcome mat as if he owned the property. He held a thick folder of freshly printed financial documents, aggressively waving them in the air like a trophy. He told the police that Camille had maliciously hacked into his company's operational accounts earlier that morning and siphoned exactly $500,000 into a secret private account. He claimed that money was a critical round of seed funding he had just secured from a major angel investor, and her vindictive theft was the sole reason his startup was currently locked out of its headquarters. He looked past me, shouting into the house, demanding that Camille come out in handcuffs immediately. He told her she was going to rot in a federal prison while he took full custody of Lily, painting her as a bitter, unstable woman trying to destroy his livelihood because she could not handle a simple divorce. He actually smiled as he asked the officers to put her in the back of the squad car so everyone could see what a thief looked like. The sheer volume of his lies was almost impressive, but it was entirely built on a foundation of desperate forged paperwork. He had scrambled together fake corporate balance sheets to match the exact deposit amount he had illegally flagged through his shady private investigator. He was trying to use the armed power of the police state to terrorize my daughter into total submission. I did not block the doorway. I did not raise my voice, curse at him, or argue with the officers. I simply stepped aside and invited the police inside my home, gesturing for Brad to follow them. He walked into my living room with a massive swagger that quickly evaporated the second he saw the man sitting calmly at my dining table. Jonathan Pierce had been having a late morning coffee with me, reviewing the month's trust distributions and property acquisitions. Jonathan stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, and introduced himself to the officers as my personal corporate attorney and the managing director of my private wealth fund. The lead officer looked confused, glancing back and forth between my faded flannel shirt and the high-powered, incredibly expensive lawyer standing in my kitchen. Jonathan did not waste a single breath. He pulled a sealed, notarized banking dossier from his briefcase and laid it flat on the wooden table. He calmly explained to the officers that the $500,000 deposited into Camille's account had absolutely zero connection to Brad's failing tech startup. Jonathan produced the original federally authenticated wire transfer receipts directly from the bank manager we had visited earlier. He showed the police the exact origin of the funds, a private wealth holding company established in 1995, long before Brad had even graduated high school. He provided the certified trust fund documentation, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the money came from my own legally protected assets. I watched the lead officer meticulously review the watermarked banking documents, his eyes scanning the multi-million-dollar balances listed under my holding company. The officer slowly looked up, his stern expression shifting into deep, unmistakable anger as he turned to face Brad. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Brad's triumphant smirk melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He stared at the certified banking documents on the table, his mind struggling to comprehend the massive numbers attached to his father-in-law's hidden empire. The realization that he had just accused a secret multimillionaire of stealing his non-existent startup funds washed over him, draining the color from his face. The lead officer handed the forged balance sheets back to Brad, stepping dangerously close to his personal space. He informed Brad in a low, dangerous tone that filing a false police report to initiate a wrongful arrest was a severe criminal offense, and forging financial documents to manipulate law enforcement into executing a warrant was a felony carrying heavy prison time. I looked at Jonathan and gave him a single subtle nod. Jonathan immediately turned to the officers and stated that we would be pressing full civil charges for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and formally requesting the district attorney to pursue criminal charges against Brad for document forgery and making false statements to law enforcement. Brad staggered backward toward my front door, his mouth opening and closing silently, realizing he had just handed the authorities everything they needed to put him in a federal prison cell. Brad staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes tripping over the uneven threshold of my front door as the police officers advanced on him. The sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes was almost pitiful as the lead officer sternly demanded he hand over his phone and the forged financial documents immediately. He was no longer the arrogant tech chief executive barking cruel orders at his wife. He was a cornered, panicking criminal realizing his fabricated reality had just collided with an immovable object. The officers escorted him to the back of the squad car, not placing him in handcuffs just yet, but firmly detaining him for official questioning regarding the falsified police report and the fraudulent bank statements. Camille watched from the hallway, her posture straightening as she saw the man who had terrorized her for 5 years being forced into the back of a police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights eventually faded down the street, leaving the neighborhood in a stunned, lingering silence. But I knew this victory was only a temporary skirmish. Brad was a weak coward, but a coward backed by vast generational wealth will always run behind his father's coattails when the real consequences arrive. The true war was about to begin. Gerald Lawson had spent his entire adult life coasting effortlessly on the momentum of old money. His grandfather had built a highly lucrative regional chain of high-end steakhouses and exclusive country club dining rooms, establishing the Lawson name as an untouchable pillar of the city's elite. Gerald inherited the empire along with a deeply ingrained, sickening sense of racial superiority. He was the kind of man who smiled politely at charity galas for the cameras, while quietly redlining neighborhoods and ensuring minority-owned businesses never secured prime commercial leases in his districts. I had encountered men exactly like Gerald in the commercial real estate sector throughout the 1980s and 90s. They were men who automatically assumed my skin color meant a lack of education, a severe lack of resources, and a total lack of legal firepower. I learned back then that arguing with their bigotry was a complete waste of breath. The only language men like Gerald understood was the total systemic dismantling of their financial leverage. By Thursday afternoon, the corrupt machinery of Gerald's wealth was already grinding into motion. Jonathan Pierce arrived at my house with a grim expression, carrying a thick stack of expedited court filings. Gerald had pulled a massive political favor, cashing in decades of campaign contributions to assign a notoriously biased judge to Brad's impending criminal case and the upcoming custody dispute. This particular judge had a long history of dismissing corporate fraud charges for wealthy defendants and possessed a heavily documented, undeniable bias against minority families in family court. Gerald was heavily stacking the deck, ensuring the legal system would protect his son and systematically strip Camille of her child, completely disregarding the undeniable forgery evidence we had just handed the police. That evening, the heavy silence of my living room was broken when my personal cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed an encrypted number, but my intuition told me exactly who was on the other end of the line. I calmly pressed the record button on my desk security console before answering the call. Gerald Lawson did not bother with formal pleasantries or fake diplomacy. His voice was thick with expensive scotch and raw, unfiltered hatred. He told me I was a foolish, arrogant old man playing a dangerous game I could not possibly win. He mocked my blue-collar plumbing background, stating that a common street thug like me had absolutely no business interfering in the elite affairs of his family. He then crossed a line that sealed his absolute destruction. Gerald warned me that his political connections ran much deeper than my bank accounts could ever reach. He explicitly used a vile racial slur, telling me that people of my kind needed to learn their place in his city and step aside when their betters commanded it. He demanded that Camille drop all divorce proceedings, hand over full custody of Lily, and sign a strict non-disclosure agreement by Friday afternoon. If we refused, he threatened to personally ensure his bought-and-paid-for judge fabricated a legal reason to have Camille deemed an unfit, unstable mother and institutionalized. He laughed a cold, wet, rattling sound, bragging that he owned the judge, he owned the local police precinct, and he would completely crush us into the dirt until we begged for mercy. He hung up the phone, thoroughly convinced he had just terrified a helpless old man into total submission. I did not shout into the receiver. I did not throw my phone across the room or let the toxic venom of his racist words poison my composure. I simply stopped the recording device and carefully saved the high-definition audio file to 3 separate encrypted offshore servers. Gerald thought he was fighting a neighborhood turf war in a rigged local courthouse. He failed to realize I had absolutely no intention of fighting him in a courtroom he already controlled. When the justice system is corrupted by old money, you do not beg a biased judge for fairness. You simply buy the very building the judge is sitting in. I picked up the phone and called Jonathan Pierce immediately. I instructed my lead attorney to completely halt our defensive preparations for the custody hearing and pivot our entire legal strike force toward Gerald's glaring corporate vulnerabilities. For years, my real estate trust had been quietly monitoring the Lawson restaurant empire. Gerald was a notoriously terrible businessman who had massively over-leveraged his grandfather's legacy to fund his lavish country club lifestyle. His flagship restaurants were drowning in bad corporate debt kept afloat only by shady refinancing agreements with a ruthless private equity firm that was currently looking to liquidate its high-risk portfolios. I commanded Jonathan to set up a blind shell company by midnight. We were going to completely bypass the rigged family courts and attack the very foundation of Gerald's arrogance. I intended to choke out his power at the source. Through the newly established anonymous shell company, I authorized a massive, highly aggressive buyout of every single defaulted commercial loan and mezzanine debt tied to the Lawson Restaurant Group. My financial team moved with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, my private trust had quietly absorbed millions of dollars of Gerald's toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, capitalizing on the private equity firm's desperation to offload the bad paper. I was no longer just the protective grandfather of the child he was trying to steal. I was now the sole majority debt holder of his entire family legacy. Gerald was going to wake up tomorrow morning feeling completely invincible, entirely unaware that his beloved empire now legally belonged to the man he had just threatened. Gerald Lawson sat behind the massive mahogany desk in his private study, sipping a glass of rare scotch. He was undoubtedly reveling in the false security of his political connections, fully believing his bought-and-paid-for judge would effortlessly crush my daughter in family court. His arrogant delusion shattered the exact second his frantic chief financial officer burst through the heavy oak doors, completely ignoring protocol. The accountant dropped a thick red-tabbed legal binder directly onto Gerald's pristine blotter, his hands shaking violently. An anonymous corporate holding company had just purchased every single piece of mezzanine debt and defaulted loan attached to the Lawson restaurant empire. The attached cover letter was not a negotiation. It was a brutal, legally ironclad margin call. The new debt holder was demanding $5 million in liquid cash within 48 hours. If Gerald failed to produce the funds, the holding company possessed the immediate legal right to seize his flagship restaurants, freeze all operating accounts, and force the entire Lawson enterprise into involuntary bankruptcy. Gerald threw his crystal glass against the far wall, the scotch staining the expensive wallpaper. He grabbed his phone and frantically dialed his private equity contacts, desperately seeking a bailout. Every single call went directly to voicemail. The invisible shell company had boxed him into a perfect, inescapable corner. He was officially drowning. His sheer panic was rooted in a dark, heavily guarded family secret that defined the Lawson lineage. Gerald's grandfather did not build their esteemed restaurant empire through honest hard work or culinary innovation. He built it during a severe economic recession by ruthlessly bankrupting his own business partners, forging loan documents, and stealing their assets for pennies on the dollar. Gerald was raised on the highly toxic belief that loyalty was a fatal weakness and the Lawson family name was the only currency that truly mattered in the world. He stared up at the imposing oil portrait of his grandfather hanging above the fireplace. That legacy was his entire identity. If he lost the flagship restaurants to a faceless creditor, he would instantly lose his membership in the elite country club circles that shielded him from the consequences of his horrific behavior. To save that sacred name and maintain his illusion of superiority, any sacrifice was acceptable, even his own flesh and blood. Gerald immediately summoned Brad to the estate. Brad arrived looking completely haggard, his designer clothes rumpled from days of intense stress. He was still reeling from being permanently locked out of his startup headquarters and facing severe police scrutiny regarding his falsified embezzlement claims against Camille. Before Brad could even open his mouth to complain about his impending criminal charges, Gerald shoved the margin call paperwork squarely into his chest. Gerald demanded that Brad immediately liquidate his remaining equity in the tech startup and transfer every single cent of the cash to the parent company to cover the massive debt. Brad stared at the paperwork in absolute horror. He protested wildly, explaining that initiating a massive fire sale of his shares during an active eviction crisis and a police investigation would trigger a total collapse of investor confidence. It would bankrupt his tech company permanently. Gerald did not care in the slightest. He slammed his heavy hands onto the desk, reminding Brad that the startup was a useless vanity project solely funded by the Lawson family name in the first place. He belittled Brad's business as a pathetic hobby, declaring that the restaurant empire was the only legitimate asset keeping their entire family out of the gutter. The ensuing screaming match echoed violently through the marble corridors of the mansion. Brad screamed right back, accusing his father of using him as a disposable financial human shield. He absolutely refused to sign the equity transfer papers, insisting he needed that money to defend himself against my incoming defamation and forgery lawsuits. Gerald turned completely ruthless. He stepped right up to his son and delivered a devastating ultimatum. If Brad did not liquidate his shares and hand over the cash by midnight, Gerald would cut him out of the family trust entirely. Furthermore, Gerald threatened to immediately revoke the legal funding for Brad's upcoming custody battle against Camille, leaving him completely defenseless in family court with zero financial backing. The father and son tore each other apart like cornered animals, their toxic, superficial bond dissolving into pure hatred the exact second their money was severely threatened. I did not need to be standing inside that mansion to know exactly how the Lawson men would react to extreme financial strangulation. From the quiet, unassuming safety of my kitchen, Camille and I sat drinking fresh coffee while Jonathan Pierce relayed the live updates from our corporate informants embedded in the financial district. Jonathan detailed the vicious screaming match at the estate and Brad's subsequent frantic attempts to contact his startup investors to cash out his worthless shares. I watched the deep, chronic tension slowly leave Camille's shoulders as she listened to the report. For 5 long years, she had been terrified of the impenetrable, unified front the Lawson men presented to the world. She truly believed their family bond was an unbreakable fortress of immense wealth and political power. Now sitting safely in my home, she saw the undeniable, ugly truth. They had no genuine loyalty. They had no honor. They were just greedy, parasitic men entirely willing to devour their own offspring to survive another day. I did not intervene in their collapse. I did not call them to gloat or offer a predatory settlement. I simply let the crushing weight of their own arrogance do the heavy lifting for me. I looked at Camille and taught her a crucial lesson about true power. When your enemies begin to violently consume each other, the smartest tactical move you can make is absolute silence. You let them exhaust all their remaining resources fighting ghosts. By late Friday afternoon, Brad's desperate attempts to sell his startup shares proved completely futile. His equity was deemed totally worthless on the secondary market due to the active police investigation into his forged banking documents. Gerald quickly realized his son could not save him, and the 48-hour deadline was rapidly approaching like a freight train. The threat of total public bankruptcy and the humiliation of losing his grandfather's empire stared him right in the face. Desperate to escape the tightening noose, Gerald made a frantic, incredibly reckless move. He completely bypassed his local financial networks, knowing his reputation was currently toxic, and initiated an emergency fire sale of the entire Lawson restaurant chain. He reached out to a notoriously aggressive foreign hospitality conglomerate, offering to sell his entire legacy at a massive, humiliating loss just to secure enough offshore cash to pay off my margin call and flee the sinking ship. He frantically signed the preliminary letter of intent that evening, entirely convinced he had just found the ultimate escape hatch to save his precious elite status. Gerald Lawson sat at the head of the polished obsidian conference table, his manicured hands resting confidently on a stack of heavily redacted corporate sale documents. Across from him sat 3 executives from a notoriously aggressive international hospitality conglomerate, men who smelled blood in the water but were eager to absorb the prestigious Lawson brand into their global portfolio. Gerald had spent the entire weekend fabricating a narrative of voluntary retirement to explain his sudden desperate fire sale. He masked his crippling panic with smooth, practiced arrogance, assuring the foreign buyers that the restaurant empire was highly profitable and free of any toxic liabilities. The executives nodded, their expensive fountain pens hovering over the signature lines of the preliminary acquisition agreement. Gerald could practically feel the offshore wire transfer hitting his accounts, a massive influx of cash that would instantly neutralize my $5 million margin call and secure his family's elite status. He raised his glass of sparkling water for a celebratory toast, completely oblivious to the legal guillotine positioned directly above his neck. My cell phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter. Jonathan Pierce's encrypted number flashed across the screen. I answered the call while wiping down the countertops, the simple, rhythmic motion grounding my focus. Jonathan's voice was crisp and professional, cutting straight to the tactical update. He informed me that Gerald's emergency board meeting had commenced and the foreign buyers were finalizing the preliminary acquisition signatures. The exact moment Gerald attempted to legally transfer the corporate assets, his entire fabricated reality would collide with a brutal, inescapable legal mechanism I had meticulously installed over a decade ago. I instructed Jonathan to execute the final maneuver. Many years prior, when I was quietly expanding my commercial real estate trust, I acquired the prime downtown acreage upon which Gerald Lawson's flagship restaurant currently operated. Gerald, blinded by his own sense of superiority, never bothered to investigate the anonymous holding company that held the master lease to his most valuable property. He assumed his landlord was just another faceless corporate entity that could be easily manipulated or ignored. For 7 consecutive years, Gerald had systematically underreported his restaurant's gross revenue to my holding company, engaging in a blatant, heavily documented pattern of lease fraud to evade his percentage rent obligations. I had allowed the fraudulent underpayments to accumulate, gathering irrefutable financial evidence, month after month, patiently weaving a legal net he could never escape. He believed he was outsmarting a faceless corporation. He was actually handing me the exact weapon required to dismantle his empire. Jonathan Pierce did not send a polite warning letter. He deployed a specialized legal strike team directly to Gerald's corporate headquarters. As Gerald smiled and extended his hand to finalize the international sale, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open violently. 3 forensic auditors, flanked by private security contractors, marched straight into the room. The lead auditor slammed a thick court-authorized injunction squarely onto the polished table, completely disrupting the celebratory atmosphere. He announced loudly, ensuring the foreign executives heard every single syllable, that the Lawson Restaurant Group was currently under active forensic investigation for severe lease fraud and gross financial misrepresentation. He informed the room that the master landlord of the flagship property had legally frozen all corporate asset transfers, pending a comprehensive multi-year audit of their operational accounts. Gerald's face drained of color, his practiced smile contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He lunged out of his leather chair, wildly demanding the auditors leave his building, threatening to call his political connections and have them arrested for trespassing. The lead auditor simply tapped the stack of court documents, calmly explaining that any attempt to finalize the sale of the company while under active investigation for defrauding a major commercial landlord constituted a federal crime. The foreign executives immediately recoiled, their corporate survival instincts overriding their desire for the Lawson brand. They swiftly packed their briefcases, muttering harsh reprimands about Gerald's lack of transparency, and marched out of the boardroom without signing a single document. Gerald watched his multi-million-dollar escape hatch vanish into the elevator, the heavy reality of total, inescapable bankruptcy crashing down upon his shoulders. The immediate fallout of the blocked sale rippled violently through the Lawson family. Gerald, utterly frantic and stripped of his usual composure, realized the anonymous entity holding his debt and the landlord triggering the audit were executing a highly coordinated surgical strike against his legacy. The precision of the attack indicated an adversary with immense resources and a deep, intimate knowledge of his financial vulnerabilities. He commanded Brad to utilize his tech industry connections to aggressively hunt down the identity of the phantom holding company, systematically destroying their lives. Brad, desperate to regain his father's volatile approval and salvage his own precarious financial standing, diverted his remaining personal funds to hire a specialized corporate intelligence firm. The private investigators bypassed standard legal channels, utilizing aggressive data mining and offshore financial tracking to trace the ownership structure of the holding companies suffocating the Lawson empire. They peeled back layers of complex corporate anonymity, following the aggressive margin calls and the devastating forensic audit back to a singular, heavily guarded trust. The investigators compiled a comprehensive dossier and delivered it directly to Brad's temporary, scaled-down office space. Brad ripped open the sealed envelope, his eyes scanning the detailed organizational charts and ownership registries. The blood turned to ice in his veins as his gaze landed on the final page. The ultimate beneficiary of the multi-million-dollar real estate trust, the man single-handedly dismantling the untouchable Lawson legacy, was Tobias Wright. Brad sat rigidly in his barren temporary office space, his eyes practically burning holes through the comprehensive dossier compiled by his expensive private investigators. The realization hit him with the sheer crushing force of a freight train. The phantom holding company dismantling his father's empire, the anonymous landlord that evicted his startup, the entity responsible for the massive $5 million margin call on the Lawson family name, it was all Tobias Wright. The man he had dismissed as a pathetic blue-collar plumber living on a fixed pension was in reality a ruthless multimillionaire commercial real estate tycoon. Brad's stomach violently churned as the magnitude of his fatal miscalculations set in. He hadn't just insulted a working-class father. He had actively antagonized the apex predator of the city's financial sector, a man holding the absolute power to systematically erase the Lawson legacy from existence. Desperation fueled by a primal need for self-preservation completely overrode Brad's ingrained arrogance. His startup was dead, his personal equity was worthless, and his father was frantically preparing to disown him to save whatever scraps remained of the restaurant empire. Brad needed an immediate, miraculous infusion of capital, and he needed the brutal financial attacks on his family to stop instantly. He formulated a desperate, sickeningly transparent plan. He believed Camille was still the same vulnerable, emotionally dependent woman he had manipulated for 5 years. He convinced himself that if he could just perform a convincing enough apology, he could manipulate her into calling off her father's attack dogs and securing him access to the hidden Wright family fortune. On Tuesday morning, a sleek delivery van pulled up to my modest house. A courier carefully carried an extravagant, ridiculously oversized floral arrangement up to my front porch. Dozens of rare white orchids imported specifically for the occasion, accompanied by an expensive box of Swiss chocolates. Brad pulled up 15 minutes later, stepping out of his leased car holding a massive velvet box. He had meticulously crafted his appearance wearing a slightly rumpled dress shirt and slacks to project the image of a broken, exhausted man deeply suffering from the weight of his own profound mistakes. He walked up my driveway, his posture slumped, and knocked softly on my front door. Camille and I were sitting in the living room having just finalized the latest round of strategic property acquisitions with Jonathan Pierce. I watched my daughter carefully through the window. The Camille of last week might have rushed to the door eager to accept his apologies and return to the toxic comfort of her familiar cage. But the Camille standing beside me now had spent the last few days witnessing the absolute uncompromising power of financial independence. She had seen the raw, undeniable evidence of Brad's relentless cruelty, and she knew precisely what kind of man was knocking on our door. She took a deep, steadying breath, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unbreakable resolve, and opened the door herself. Brad immediately dropped to his knees right there on my cracked concrete porch, the velvet box clutched tightly in his hands. He launched into a tearful, heavily rehearsed monologue, his voice trembling with manufactured agony. He begged for her forgiveness, claiming the stress of his startup had completely destroyed his mental health and driven him to make horrific, unforgivable decisions. He dramatically apologized for the cake incident, blaming his father's toxic influence and his own severe, blinding insecurity. He swore he had changed, promising to dedicate the rest of his life to making her and Lily happy, completely ignoring the fact that he was currently facing severe criminal charges for forging financial documents to have her arrested. He held up the velvet box, popping it open to reveal a massive glittering diamond necklace, a blatant, desperate attempt to buy her submission with shiny trinkets. Camille stared down at the man groveling on our porch, her face devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. She did not yell, she did not cry, and she absolutely refused to accept his pathetic offering. She simply looked at him with a cold, terrifyingly calm precision, her voice steady and unwavering. She told Brad that she knew exactly why he was on his knees. She knew his startup was dead, she knew his father's empire was burning, and she knew his private investigators had uncovered the truth about her father's wealth. She systematically dismantled his entire performance, stating that his tears were not for his broken family, but for his rapidly vanishing bank accounts. Brad's performative sorrow instantly vanished, his face hardening as he realized his manipulation tactics were completely useless. He started to scramble to his feet, but before he could utter a single word of protest, Jonathan Pierce stepped out from the hallway flanked by a licensed process server. The server stepped forward, handing Brad a thick, sealed legal envelope. Camille informed Brad that she was officially serving him with divorce papers. Furthermore, she detailed the contents of the petition she was demanding full sole legal and physical custody of Lily, citing his erratic, abusive behavior and his pending felony charges for filing a false police report. She also made it abundantly clear that she would be pursuing maximum child support utilizing his family's remaining assets before my trust completely liquidated them. Brad snatched the envelope, his hands shaking with a mixture of raw fury and total inescapable panic. He stared at Camille, realizing the woman he had controlled for years was now the one holding the absolute power to destroy him. He turned his venomous gaze toward me, pointing a shaking finger and screaming that I had poisoned his wife's mind, vowing to drag us through the mud in family court. I simply looked at him, completely unbothered by his hollow threats, and closed my heavy wooden door directly in his face. The reality of his total defeat finally registered in Brad's mind as he drove away from my house. He was losing his wife, his child, his company, and his family's legacy all at once. His father had officially cut him off, his investors had abandoned him, and he was facing potential jail time. Cornered, humiliated, and completely stripped of his rational faculties, Brad made a horrific, unhinged decision. He convinced himself that if he could just secure physical possession of Lily, he could use his daughter as the ultimate leverage to force Camille into dropping the divorce and force me to call off the financial siege on the Lawson empire. At 2:30 in the afternoon, while Camille and I were reviewing the final details of the divorce petition with Jonathan, my personal cell phone buzzed with an urgent alert. It was an automated notification from Lily's elementary school, a standard security message sent to all registered guardians when a child is signed out early. The message stated clearly that Lily had been picked up from the main office by her father, Brad Lawson, due to a sudden, undisclosed family emergency. The icy grip of absolute terror immediately seized Camille's chest as the implications of the notification set in. Brad had bypassed the standard pickup protocols and taken Lily before the emergency custody orders could be formally finalized by a judge. The man who had just lost everything had just taken the only thing we truly cared about. Camille dropped her phone onto the wooden floorboards, the loud, harsh crack echoing through the silent living room. She dropped to her knees, frantically grabbing the device to read the notification again, praying it was a systemic error from the school district. It was not. A second notification chimed immediately after the first. A direct text message from Brad flashed across the screen. The image illuminated the room with a picture of Lily sitting in the passenger seat of Brad's car, happily eating a piece of candy, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just been abducted by her own father. Below the photo was a block of text dripping with unhinged malice and sheer desperation. Brad informed Camille that he was taking his daughter on a highly exclusive permanent vacation. He stated plainly that if she or her father contacted the local police department, he would smash his phone, ditch his current vehicle, and ensure they would never see Lily again. Camille screamed a raw, primal sound of absolute maternal terror. She grabbed my shirt collar, her hands shaking violently, and begged me to save her child. I placed both of my hands firmly on her shoulders, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. I refused to let her drown in the blind panic Brad was actively weaponizing against us. In the early 1990s, when my real estate portfolio first crossed the $10 million threshold, a corrupt city zoning inspector tried to extort me by threatening to condemn my most valuable properties using entirely fabricated safety violations. He expected me to panic, to grovel, and to hand over a briefcase of untraceable cash to protect my livelihood. I learned a vital lesson during that ordeal. The precise moment you negotiate with an extortionist, you hand them the permanent leash to your life. I destroyed that inspector by quietly uncovering his offshore bank accounts and handing the meticulous ledger directly to federal authorities. I did not negotiate with terrorists back then, and I absolutely refused to negotiate with a pathetic, cowardly man using my own granddaughter as a human shield today. Brad's messages continued to flood Camille's phone, each one more frantic and delusional than the last. He laid out his ransom demands with absolute arrogant precision. He demanded that Camille immediately contact her lawyer to withdraw the divorce petition, along with the sole custody filing. Furthermore, he explicitly ordered me to call off the $5 million margin call on the Lawson Restaurant Group and permanently cancel the forensic audit currently freezing his father's international sale. He gave us exactly 2 hours to furnish verified proof that the legal and financial blockades had been completely dismantled. If we failed to comply, or if he saw a single police cruiser in his rearview mirror, he promised to board an international flight with Lily to a jurisdiction that specifically did not recognize American custody laws. Camille was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to just call the auditors off. She pleaded with me to give the Lawsons whatever money they wanted, offering to sign away all her future rights to my trust if it meant getting Lily back safely. Brad was banking entirely on our emotional collapse. He assumed a desperate mother and a terrified grandfather would instantly surrender their immense financial leverage to save their bloodline. He thought he could outsmart the room by creating a hostage situation. I did not dial emergency services. Alerting standard law enforcement would trigger a statewide alert broadcast, Brad's license plate on every highway billboard, and inevitably push a desperate cornered man into making a fatal, highly erratic decision on the road. I needed surgical precision, not a loud public manhunt. I turned to Jonathan Pierce, who was already pulling out his encrypted laptop from his briefcase. I instructed my lawyer to contact the elite corporate security and intelligence firm retained by my real estate trust. These were not local private detectives handling infidelity cases. They were former federal agents and independent cybersecurity contractors who specialized in tracking stolen corporate assets and executing extractions across international borders. I authorized unlimited operational funding and gave them a single uncompromising objective: find my granddaughter immediately. Within 4 minutes, my intelligence team had completely bypassed standard legal warrants to breach Brad's digital footprint. Because Brad had proven himself to be a creature of immense comfort and unyielding habit, he lacked the basic intelligence and discipline to go entirely off the grid. He was still relying on the automated systems tied to his vehicle and his remaining active financial accounts. My security team intercepted the transponder signal from his leased luxury sedan, isolating its unique frequency. They cross-referenced the moving signal with municipal traffic cameras and digital toll booth scanners along the major interstates leaving the city. But the definitive breakthrough came from a single deeply arrogant transaction. Brad had stopped at a high-end boutique grocery store on the rural outskirts of the county to buy expensive snacks for the impending flight. He used a secondary corporate credit card tied to his father's restaurant holding company, assuming it was safe from Camille's frozen personal accounts. The transaction triggered an instant geographical ping on my security team's monitoring software. They had his exact location, his trajectory, and his current speed. He was driving fast, but he was completely blind to the invisible net tightening around his vehicle. The chief security contractor patched directly into Jonathan's laptop, projecting a high-resolution satellite map onto the screen. A pulsating red dot tracked Brad's vehicle moving rapidly down a secluded, unpaved highway far beyond the city limits. He was not heading toward the city's main international airport, where standard security protocols and federal agents would inevitably flag a nervous man traveling alone with a young child amidst a messy custody dispute. He was driving straight toward the rural county borders, maneuvering through back roads to avoid highway patrol. Jonathan quickly cross-referenced the geographical coordinates of the red dot with our comprehensive property databases, his face draining of color as the destination loaded on the screen. The red dot was accelerating toward a private, heavily guarded aviation strip hidden behind acres of dense forest. It was a boutique, unregulated airstrip partially owned by a quiet shell company directly managed by Gerald Lawson. They were bypassing commercial security entirely to board an unscheduled private charter jet attempting to vanish into the sky before the family courts even opened the next morning. The tires of my heavy SUV tore through the gravel of the secluded county road, kicking up thick clouds of dust as we accelerated toward the hidden aviation gates. Camille sat rigid in the passenger seat, her knuckles completely white as she gripped the dashboard. Jonathan Pierce occupied the rear, quietly coordinating with the local tactical police units my security team had intercepted and redirected. We were not waiting for warrants. The red dot on Jonathan's monitor had stopped moving entirely, locking exactly onto the coordinates of Gerald Lawson's private runway. I smashed the heavy steel bumper of my truck directly through the flimsy wooden security barricade at the entrance, not slowing down for a single fraction of a second. The airstrip opened up before us, a bleak stretch of cracked asphalt surrounded by towering pines. At the far end of the runway, the twin engines of a sleek, mid-sized charter jet were already spooling up, emitting a high-pitched, deafening whine. Brad's leased luxury sedan was parked haphazardly near the boarding stairs, both front doors thrown wide open. He was attempting to load my granddaughter onto a plane destined for a country completely outside the reach of the American judicial system. Gerald Lawson had acquired his minority stake in this unregulated airstrip during the late 1990s, treating it as the ultimate status symbol among his elite country club peers. Men of his specific pedigree always built expensive escape hatches, fully anticipating the day their fraudulent business practices would catch up with them. When my wife Sylvia and I were carefully structuring our real estate trust, we actively studied the financial habits of these arrogant men. Sylvia noted that old money families invested heavily in the illusion of untouchability, buying private jets and remote land to convince themselves the rules of society did not apply to their bloodline. They relied entirely on intimidation and exclusive access to maintain their power. Gerald assumed this hidden runway was his personal kingdom, a sanctuary where his family's crimes could simply fly away into the clouds. He severely underestimated the reach of a man who owned the very ground he was trying to abandon. I slammed the brakes, throwing the SUV into park before it had even fully stopped sliding across the tarmac. I stepped out into the deafening roar of the jet engines, the heavy wind from the turbines whipping aggressively against my jacket. Camille scrambled out behind me, her eyes immediately locking onto the small, terrified figure standing near the aircraft stairs. Lily was clutching her pink backpack, crying loudly, her small feet planted firmly on the asphalt as Brad aggressively yanked her arm, trying to force her up the metal steps. He was screaming at the pilot to close the cabin door, completely unhinged and dripping with sweat. Before Camille could sprint across the tarmac, a towering figure stepped out from the deep shadows beneath the wing of the aircraft. It was Gerald Lawson. He moved with a stiff, desperate rigidity, placing himself squarely between us and the boarding stairs. His tailored suit was unbuttoned, his tie loose, entirely stripped of the polished country club superiority he had wielded at Lily's birthday party. The massive margin call had broken his corporate empire, and the impending forensic audit had trapped his remaining assets. This flight was not just Brad's desperate escape, it was Gerald's last viable bid for total freedom. I walked directly toward him, keeping my posture completely straight, ignoring the screaming turbine engines. Gerald raised his right hand, his fingers shaking violently, and pointed a compact silver semi-automatic pistol squarely at my chest. He yelled at me to stay exactly where I was, the vile racist hatred finally boiling over without any polite societal filters. He called me a filthy, arrogant thug who had ruined his pristine family legacy. He explicitly stated he would shoot me dead on the asphalt if I took one more step, claiming he would easily bribe any rural county judge into ruling it a justifiable self-defense shooting against a crazed, violent trespasser. He told Camille to get back in the truck, swearing that Brad was taking Lily to Europe and they would permanently erase us from the child's life. He held the gun with the erratic, unpredictable energy of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He truly believed the weapon in his hand was the ultimate equalizer, the one thing my immense money could not defeat. I did not raise my hands. I did not flinch, cower, or plead for my life. Staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon held by a desperate, ruined man, I maintained absolute, terrifying silence. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. Gerald tensed his finger, tightening dangerously on the trigger, but I slowly withdrew a single brightly colored piece of heavy cardstock. It was an expedited, federally stamped repossession order. I held the document up in the harsh runway lights. I did not need to shout over the engines. Right at that exact second, the deafening whine of the charter jet abruptly sputtered and died. The turbine blades began to slow down, the sudden silence sweeping across the tarmac like a heavy blanket. The pilot stepped out onto the top of the stairs, looking down at Gerald with an apologetic shrug. He informed Gerald that the Central Aviation Authority had just grounded the aircraft, and the holding company that owned the plane's primary financing had successfully executed a remote lockdown on the navigation systems. I took one step forward, forcing Gerald to look me in the eye. I calmly informed him that his private equity firm had collateralized this exact jet to secure his failing restaurant debt. When my trust purchased that debt yesterday, I legally purchased the plane he was attempting to flee in. I triggered the repossession clause exactly 15 minutes ago. At that very moment, a massive convoy of heavily armed police cruisers burst onto the runway from the access roads, their sirens wailing and tactical lights blinding the dark tarmac. The authorities completely surrounded the aircraft, drawing their weapons and screaming for Gerald to drop the gun. Gerald's shoulders collapsed. He dropped the silver pistol onto the asphalt, realizing he had just brought a gun to a financial execution. Camille sprinted past the surrendering men, snatching Lily into her arms and holding her tight against her chest, sobbing with absolute relief. The police forcefully shoved Gerald against the side of the repossessed jet, locking heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Brad was dragged down the aircraft stairs, screaming hysterically as officers read him his Miranda rights for felony kidnapping. The victory felt absolute as I watched them shove the arrogant tech executive into the back of a squad car. But the Lawsons were like a deeply rooted infection. Just as the police cruisers prepared to transport Brad to the county jail, a sleek black town car sped onto the tarmac. Stephen Hayes, the ruthless family lawyer, stepped out waving an emergency medical injunction signed by a notoriously corrupt private psychiatrist. He loudly declared to the commanding officer that Brad Lawson was suffering from a medically certified episode of acute, temporary psychosis and could not be legally held in a standard jail cell. He was aggressively demanding immediate medical bail, setting the stage for a brutal battle in criminal court. Stephen Hayes, waving that fraudulent medical injunction on the windswept tarmac, did not secure Brad a luxury hospital bed. It only guaranteed him a highly expedited high-security transfer to the county detention center holding cells. The local police commander, furious that a wealthy executive had nearly orchestrated an international kidnapping right under his jurisdiction, flatly refused to honor the private psychiatrist's note on the runway. The morning after the aborted flight, the harsh fluorescent lights of the criminal courthouse illuminated a starkly different reality for the Lawson family. The oppressive scent of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee replaced the crisp air of their exclusive country clubs. Camille sat right beside me on the hard wooden benches of the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, refusing to show a single ounce of vulnerability. Brad was escorted into the courtroom, wearing a bright orange standard-issue jumpsuit, his hands heavily shackled to a thick waist chain. The arrogant tech executive who had shoved cake into my daughter's face was completely gone, replaced by a trembling, hyperventilating shell of a man, heavily relying on a fabricated psychological defense to escape the brutal consequences of his own actions. For 3 generations, the Lawson men had utilized a highly specific, incredibly expensive legal playbook whenever their abhorrent behavior crossed into criminal territory. They never took genuine accountability for their actions. They always purchased bespoke medical diagnoses from corrupt private physicians, classifying their greed, violence, and manipulation as unfortunate symptoms of acute stress or temporary exhaustion. They would secure immediate medical bail retreat to a 5-star rehabilitation resort in the mountains and let their high-powered attorneys bury their victims under mountains of aggressive, financially crippling litigation until the charges were quietly dropped. Brad fully expected this bail hearing to follow that exact time-tested family tradition. He believed his wealth automatically granted him an exemption from the brutal reality of a federal holding cell. He did not realize my legal team had spent the last 48 hours systematically severing every single string he relied upon. Stephen Hayes stood before the presiding judge, launching into a meticulously rehearsed, deeply manipulative performance. He completely ignored the undeniable reality that Brad had attempted to smuggle a 7-year-old child across international borders. Instead, he painted his client as a tragic victim of intense corporate sabotage and profound domestic neglect. Hayes presented the heavily forged psychiatric evaluation to the court, arguing with absolute conviction that the sudden traumatic loss of his startup company and the abrupt, cruel departure of his wife had triggered a severe temporary psychotic break. He claimed Brad was not in his right mind when he took Lily from the elementary school, genuinely believing he was protecting his daughter from an unstable, vindictive mother who had conspired with a ruthless real estate conglomerate to bankrupt him. Hayes paced the courtroom floor, projecting his voice to ensure the gallery heard every calculated lie. He detailed Camille's supposed financial greed, twisting the narrative to suggest she had orchestrated his downfall out of pure malice. Brad played his part flawlessly. He sat at the defense table, his shoulders violently shaking as he forced tears down his cheeks. He kept looking back at Camille with an expression of profound, manufactured agony, whispering loudly enough for the court reporter to hear that he just wanted his family back. Hayes passionately implored the judge to grant immediate medical bail, requesting that Brad be transferred directly to a private luxury psychiatric facility in a neighboring state where he could receive the intensive specialized care required for his sudden breakdown. He argued that placing a fragile, non-violent white-collar executive in the general population of a county jail would be excessively cruel and completely disproportionate to the incident. He actually had the audacity to suggest that returning Brad to the comfort of his family estate under the supervision of private nurses was the most humane resolution for the child involved. I did not react to the staggering volume of lies filling the courtroom. I did not shake my head, scoff, or whisper angrily to Camille. I simply gave Jonathan Pierce a brief, affirmative nod. Jonathan stood up from the prosecutor's auxiliary table, adjusting his glasses with meticulous, unhurried precision. He addressed the judge in a calm, authoritative tone, completely void of the theatrical desperation Hayes had just displayed. Jonathan stated that the prosecution had zero objections to reviewing Brad's psychological evaluation. However, he respectfully requested to submit a single piece of supplementary evidence regarding the defense's claim of a sudden, unpredictable psychotic break. Jonathan handed a sealed digital drive to the court clerk and requested permission to play the audio file for the official record. The judge nodded, intrigued by the absolute confidence in my lawyer's posture. Jonathan did not offer a dramatic preamble. He simply pressed play. The crisp, high-definition recording of Gerald Lawson's phone call from just a few nights ago echoed loudly through the courtroom speakers. Gerald's voice filled the room, heavy with expensive scotch and dripping with unapologetic racist hatred. The entire court listened in stunned silence as Gerald explicitly outlined his coordinated plan to use his political connections to crush Camille, threatened to fabricate reasons to have her institutionalized, and demanded total compliance to protect the Lawson empire. He used undeniable slurs, showcasing a disgusting sense of racial superiority that stripped away any illusion of respectability. The recording proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the kidnapping was not the result of a sudden mental breakdown caused by marital stress. It was a premeditated, highly calculated tactical maneuver executed by a family deeply accustomed to using terror and extortion to maintain their power. Brad's psychotic break was a complete fiction, a pathetic legal shield designed to protect a man executing a coordinated family conspiracy. The oppressive silence that followed the recording was absolute. Stephen Hayes visibly paled, his perfectly constructed psychological defense instantly reduced to dust before his eyes. The judge's expression hardened into a mask of pure judicial fury. She slammed her wooden gavel down immediately, denying the request for medical bail. and ordering Brad remanded to the county jail without bond, citing him as a severe flight risk and a clear documented danger to the child. As the bailiffs forcefully dragged a screaming, sobbing Brad out of the courtroom, I noticed a figure standing perfectly still near the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery. Evelyn Lawson, Gerald's wife, and the true ruthless matriarch of the family, was staring directly at me. Her husband was facing federal weapons charges, her son was being hauled to a concrete cell, and her empire was burning to the ground. But Evelyn did not shed a single tear. She simply raised her sleek smartphone to her ear, turning her back to the courtroom, actively initiating the deeply funded shadow war she had prepared for this exact scenario. She was already funneling her untraceable offshore slush funds to quietly purchase and intimidate the witnesses we would need for the impending criminal trial. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the first satellite news van aggressively hopped the curb across from my property. By the time Camille and I sat down for breakfast, 3 more regional news crews had established a perimeter around my front lawn, their camera lenses aimed directly at my living room windows. Evelyn Lawson had wasted absolutely no time. Her husband was locked in a federal holding facility, her son was awaiting trial in a county jail, and her generational restaurant empire was completely paralyzed by my forensic auditors. Stripped of her immediate legal options, the ruthless matriarch pivoted to the only battlefield she believed she still controlled. She initiated a scorched earth public relations smear campaign, leveraging her vast high society network to completely destroy my character. The narrative Evelyn manufactured was vicious, calculated, and deeply rooted in the exact same racial prejudice her husband had displayed. She retained an elite, notoriously aggressive crisis management firm to plant fabricated stories across every major local media outlet. They did not attack my plumbing business. They attacked my private trust, painting me as a predatory, shadow-funded corporate raider who used illegal backdoor financial tactics to aggressively dismantle a historically significant philanthropic white family. They strategically leaked heavily redacted, out-of-context financial documents to friendly journalists, suggesting I had exploited a minor marital dispute to execute a hostile, illegitimate takeover of the Lawson properties. They painted Camille as an unstable, manipulative gold digger who had colluded with her wealthy, thuggish father to steal Brad's child and ruin his promising tech startup. The morning broadcasts were filled with wealthy country club acquaintances weeping on camera, testifying to Brad's upstanding character and Gerald's charitable heart, framing them as innocent victims of a ruthless, coordinated attack. Camille stood by the window, her hands trembling with righteous fury as she watched a reporter stand on our sidewalk and repeat Evelyn's venomous lies to a live television audience. She turned to me, demanding that we immediately release the audio recording of Gerald's racist extortion attempt to the press. She wanted to clear our names and publicly expose the true, vile nature of the Lawson family. I gently placed a hand on her shoulder, steering her away from the window and the flashing cameras. In the late 1990s, a hostile commercial developer attempted to ruin my public standing by leaking false environmental hazard reports about my newly acquired properties. He wanted me to engage in a loud, messy public defense, knowing the ensuing media circus would scare away my high-profile commercial tenants. I learned a critical rule of warfare during that ordeal. You never step into the mud to wrestle a pig because you both end up filthy, and the pig actually enjoys it. I told Camille that engaging with Evelyn's media circus was a tactical trap. Releasing the audio to the press would instantly compromise our ongoing criminal cases and drag my granddaughter's name into a perpetual tabloid frenzy. We were not going to fight Evelyn on television. We were going to suffocate her war chest. I sat down at my desk and opened a secure communication channel with Jonathan Pierce. I directed his attention away from the television broadcasts and focused entirely on the logistics of Evelyn's sudden offensive. Crisis management firms of that elite caliber required massive immediate cash retainers, often exceeding $1 million up front. Evelyn was also actively funneling bribes to potential witnesses and securing high-priced appellate lawyers for her husband and son. I asked Jonathan a simple, devastating question. Where was the money coming from? Gerald's domestic accounts were entirely frozen by my active forensic lease audit, and Brad's personal equity was completely wiped out. Evelyn was drawing from a hidden well, and I wanted it poisoned immediately. Jonathan deployed the same elite intelligence contractors who had tracked Brad's vehicle during the kidnapping attempt. They completely ignored the noisy media spectacle and initiated a deep-dive forensic trace on the retainer wires sent to the public relations firm. Within 8 hours, the cyber team cracked the routing sequence. Evelyn Lawson was not just a complicit country club wife. She was the highly sophisticated architect of the family's dark money. The intelligence team traced the massive wire transfers back to a heavily fortified private bank located in the Cayman Islands. For 3 decades, Evelyn had been systematically skimming untaxed, unreported cash revenue from the Lawson restaurant empire. She laundered the money through a complex web of anonymous shell companies, ultimately funneling millions into a massive offshore slush fund. This was her untouchable reserve, the golden shield she used to fund bribes, manipulate local politics, and maintain her family's absolute superiority. I did not instruct Jonathan to hand this information over to local law enforcement. Evelyn's political connections were deeply embedded in the local precinct, and a standard police investigation would take months to secure international subpoenas. I did not have months to wait while she terrorized my family and the press. I needed her financial life support severed immediately. I instructed Jonathan to bypass the local authorities entirely and set up a direct, heavily encrypted video conference with the Executive Compliance Board of the Cayman Bank. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I sat before my monitor facing 4 highly polished international banking executives. They initially looked annoyed, accustomed to operating with total impunity. I did not introduce myself with pleasantries. I immediately authorized Jonathan to transmit a highly compressed, undeniable data packet directly to their secure servers. I spoke clearly, my voice resonating with the uncompromising authority of a man who managed a massive, internationally recognized real estate trust. I informed the board that their prestigious institution was currently holding an illegal slush fund actively managed by Evelyn Lawson. I directed them to review the transmitted files, which contained irrefutable proof that Evelyn was actively utilizing their banking infrastructure to fund domestic witness tampering, judicial bribery, and the legal defense of a man currently facing federal kidnapping charges. I gave the executives a simple, brutal ultimatum. They could instantly and permanently freeze every single asset account and safety deposit box tied to Evelyn Lawson and her shell companies. Alternatively, I would take the entire data packet along with my own considerable institutional weight and hand it directly to the United States Treasury Department, Interpol, and the International Financial Regulatory Commissions. I promised to publicly expose their bank as an active facilitator of international kidnapping and corporate money laundering, permanently destroying their global operating licenses. The foreign executives stared at the undeniable digital evidence on their screens. They were men motivated entirely by institutional survival. The decision required zero deliberation. Protecting one wealthy client was absolutely not worth risking the total destruction of their global banking charter. The lead executive nodded grimly, typing a command into his terminal. He verbally confirmed that a hard, irreversible freeze had been initiated across all of Evelyn Lawson's holdings. She was officially cut off from her own stolen fortune. Across the city, sitting in the opulent drawing room of her sprawling estate, Evelyn Lawson confidently handed her exclusive black credit card to her crisis manager to authorize another $1 million media buy. The machine declined the transaction. Annoyed, she provided a secondary platinum card. It also declined. A sudden cold dread washed over her face as she opened her secure banking application on her phone. The screen displayed a series of flashing red errors. Her accounts were locked. Her balances read 0. Her offshore wires were bouncing back. She dialed her private banker in the Caymans only to receive an automated message stating the number was no longer in service for her account. Evelyn dropped her phone, the blood completely draining from her face. The crushing reality of her absolute defeat finally broke through her decades of manufactured superiority. Her husband was gone, her son was gone, and the invisible fortune that protected her had vanished into thin air. She was completely cornered, stripped of every legal and financial weapon she possessed. In that moment of absolute unhinged desperation, Evelyn crossed a line from which there was no return. She walked to a hidden wall safe behind a portrait of her grandfather and extracted a dusty prepaid burner phone. She scrolled to a heavily encrypted number she had not dialed since the late 1980s, a number belonging to a ruthless shadow broker she had previously used to violently silence union organizers attempting to unionize her restaurants. She pressed the call button, her eyes burning with pure homicidal hatred. She requested an immediate lethal contract on Tobias Wright, offering to pay whatever price was demanded in untraceable diamonds hidden within her estate. The shadow war had ended, and the physical war was about to begin. The crisp autumn air hanging over my modest neighborhood offered no warning of the violence creeping up my driveway. At 2 in the morning, the street was entirely silent, bathed in the dim, flickering orange glow of a single faulty street lamp. 2 men moved through the heavy shadows of the large oak tree in my front yard. They were professionals dressed in unmarked black tactical gear, carrying suppressed automatic weapons and heavy steel canisters filled with highly volatile industrial accelerants. Evelyn Lawson had not hired local thugs to send a message. She had wired her untraceable diamonds to a shadow broker who dispatched contract killers. Their objective was absolute. They were instructed to breach my house, execute me in my sleep, and burn the structure to the concrete foundation to erase all forensic evidence. They operated under the fatal assumption that I was exactly what my public profile suggested: a retired, blue-collar plumber living alone in an outdated suburban home. They bypassed the front porch and moved with practiced lethal efficiency toward the rear patio. The taller of the 2 men pulled a specialized crowbar from his vest, wedging it expertly into the seam of my wooden back door. With a sharp, sudden crack, the deadbolt gave way. The door swung open, revealing the pitch-black interior of my kitchen. They stepped inside, immediately unscrewing the caps of their heavy canisters. The pungent, suffocating odor of chemical accelerant instantly saturated the air as they began pouring the liquid across the hardwood floors, soaking the baseboards and the fabric of the living room rug. The plan was brutally simple. They would saturate the escape routes, proceed to the master bedroom to finish the assassination, and strike a match on their way out. The lead intruder drew his suppressed weapons, signaling his partner to flank the hallway. They kicked the master bedroom door open, sweeping the corners of the room with the laser sights of their rifles. The laser beams danced across the plain cotton bed sheets. The bed was perfectly made, completely untouched. The closet doors were wide open, revealing empty hangers. There were no photographs on the nightstand, no clothes in the hamper, and no shoes by the door. The house was entirely vacant. A sharp metallic click echoed through the empty hallway, freezing both men in their tracks. It was not the sound of a weapon being cocked. It was the sound of a heavy industrial relay engaging. Before the intruders could pivot back toward the kitchen, the house violently reacted to their presence. A blaring high-decibel siren did not sound. Instead, a series of explosive pneumatic mechanisms triggered simultaneously across the entire property. Heavy ballistic-grade titanium shutters crashed down over every single window in the house, locking into the reinforced windowsills with a deafening steel thud. The wooden back door they had just breached violently slammed shut, pushed by a motorized hydraulic arm concealed within the wall framing. 4 heavy steel deadbolts drove straight into the door frame, permanently sealing the exit. The men lunged toward the front door, slamming their shoulders against the wood, only to find a secondary layer of reinforced security mesh deployed across the entryway. They raised their rifles and fired a sustained burst of suppressed gunfire directly into the living room window. The bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the customized, shatterproof ballistic glass positioned directly behind the titanium shutters. Evelyn Lawson had sent assassins to a vulnerable suburban home, completely unaware that I had spent the last decade quietly retrofitting the property into an impenetrable military-grade fortress. Miles away, sitting in the secure, climate-controlled observation deck of my primary commercial skyscraper, I watched the intruders panic in high definition. Jonathan Pierce stood silently beside me as the wall of monitors displayed the thermal and infrared feeds from the hidden cameras positioned in every room of my old house. Camille and Lily were sleeping soundly in a fortified penthouse suite 3 floors above us, completely isolated from the violence the Lawson family was attempting to inflict. I stared at the monitors, watching the 2 contract killers frantically pacing the saturated living room floor, realizing they were trapped inside a highly combustible cage of their own making. I reached forward and pressed a single button on the command console. Inside the house, the ventilation system immediately reversed its airflow. The powerful commercial exhaust fans I had installed in the attic roared to life, rapidly sucking the oxygen out of the sealed rooms and replacing it with a localized, non-lethal suppression gas. The chemical accelerant they had poured on the floor began to evaporate instantly, neutralizing the fire hazard. The men dropped their weapons, coughing violently, as the suppression gas irritated their lungs and blurred their vision. They stumbled blindly through the hallway, collapsing onto their knees in the dark. I did not gloat. I did not broadcast my voice through a hidden speaker to taunt them. I simply picked up a dedicated, encrypted phone line and contacted the precinct captain of the local tactical police unit. I provided the exact coordinates of my property, informed him that 2 armed suspects were currently sealed inside a fortified containment zone, and provided the digital access codes to remotely unlock the front door. Within 4 minutes, an armored police transport vehicle tore through my front lawn, tearing up the grass as heavily armed tactical officers swarmed the porch. I remotely lifted the titanium shutter on the front door and disengaged the magnetic locks. The SWAT team breached the entryway, flooding the living room with blinding tactical lights. They found Evelyn's highly paid assassins coughing on the floor, completely disoriented and fully stripped of their weapons. The officers dragged them out by their tactical vests, slamming them face down onto the concrete driveway and locking heavy steel cuffs around their wrists. The subsequent interrogation at the federal holding facility was brutally short. The shadow broker had assured the two men that this was a low-risk, high-reward assignment targeting an unprotected civilian. They now found themselves facing state charges for armed breaking and entering felony arson and federal charges for attempted assassination. They were looking at consecutive life sentences in a maximum security penitentiary. Professional criminals possess zero loyalty to wealthy socialites who provide bad intelligence. To save themselves from the harshest penalties, the intruders immediately rolled on their employer. They demanded full immunity agreements and handed the federal prosecutors everything they possessed. They provided the exact digital routing numbers of the offshore slush fund, the encrypted text messages detailing my home address, and the precise, unedited voice recordings of Evelyn Lawson demanding my execution. The sun had fully risen by the time the massive convoy of federal agents and county sheriffs arrived at the sprawling wrought iron gates of the Lawson estate. There was no media presence to witness the final devastating blow. Evelyn Lawson was sitting alone in her grand, echoing dining room, staring blankly at the inactive screen of her burner phone, waiting for a confirmation text that would never arrive. Her husband was gone, her son was gone, and her money was permanently frozen. The violent shattering of her solid oak front door signaled the absolute end of her dynasty. A dozen federal agents flooded the marble foyer, their heavy boots trampling over the priceless antique rugs. They stormed the dining room, their weapons drawn, shouting commands that shattered the aristocratic silence of the mansion. Evelyn did not run. She simply sat at the head of her long, polished dining table, her face a mask of pale, rigid shock. An agent grabbed her arms, pulling her forcefully from her chair and snapping cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. The matriarch of the Lawson family, the woman who had spent decades destroying lives from the shadows of her country club, was dragged out the front door in her silk mourning robe. She was pushed into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, completely stripped of her power, her wealth, and her freedom. The Lawson family had attempted to bury me completely, failing to realize I owned the shovel. The sterile, suffocating atmosphere of the county family courthouse provided a stark contrast to the violent federal raids that had permanently dismantled the Lawson family dynasty just a few weeks prior. I sat in the front row of the hard wooden gallery benches, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely unreadable. Camille sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, radiating an aura of absolute, unbreakable resolve. She wore a sharp navy blue dress suit, her hands calmly folded in front of her. She was no longer the frightened, financially manipulated woman who had suffered through years of intense psychological abuse. She was a woman who had witnessed the true, uncompromising power of absolute leverage, and she was now fully prepared to exercise it. Across the room, a large, high-definition television monitor was mounted to the wood-paneled wall, displaying a live encrypted video feed directly from the county detention center. Brad Lawson sat in a stark cinder-block holding room flanked by an armed county bailiff. He was permanently stripped of his expensive designer suits and his leased luxury vehicles. He wore a bright, heavy orange jumpsuit, his wrists firmly secured to a thick steel waist chain that rattled loudly against the metal table every time he shifted his weight. His face was pale, his eyes heavily sunken from weeks of severe sleep deprivation and unrelenting fear, but the familiar venomous arrogance still lingered in his expression. Even behind bars, facing decades in federal prison for felony kidnapping, Brad genuinely believed he held one final devastating weapon to use against my daughter. Brad had retained a notoriously aggressive, high-priced divorce attorney, a man who had clearly secured his massive cash retainer long before my forensic auditors successfully froze the Lawson family accounts. The lawyer stood before the presiding judge, projecting an air of absolute manufactured confidence. He opened his leather briefcase and dramatically produced a thick, heavily bound legal document. It was the prenuptial agreement Camille had signed 7 years ago, back when she naively believed Brad was a hardworking entrepreneur and not a calculating, deeply entitled predator. The defense attorney meticulously detailed the brutal, uncompromising terms of the contract for the official court record. The agreement was an ironclad financial cage designed to guarantee total submission. It dictated that in the event of a divorce, Camille explicitly waived all rights to any form of spousal support or alimony. She surrendered any and all claims to Brad's tech startup equity, his future earnings, and his inherited shares in the vast Lawson restaurant empire. The contract mandated that she would walk away with absolutely nothing but the meager personal belongings she had originally brought into the marriage. Brad stared directly through the camera lens on the monitor, a cruel, vindictive smirk twisting his face. He believed he was executing his ultimate revenge. He intended to leave the mother of his child completely destitute, forcing her to rely on public charity just to feed her daughter. He wanted her broken, humiliated, and begging for scraps. I did not react to the lawyer's theatrical performance. I did not shake my head, scowl, or whisper an angry remark to my daughter. I simply watched the proceedings with the cold, calculating patience of a man who had already secured the absolute victory. I gave Jonathan Pierce a single, almost imperceptible nod. Jonathan stood up from his chair, adjusting his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue about the fundamental moral unfairness of the contract, nor did he attempt to claim that Camille had signed the document under severe emotional duress. He simply walked directly to the judge's bench and handed over a heavy-sealed financial ledger compiled by my elite corporate security team. Jonathan addressed the court with an unwavering, authoritative tone. He stated clearly that the foundational requirement of any legally binding prenuptial agreement is the complete, transparent, and honest disclosure of all financial assets by both parties at the exact time of signing. He instructed the judge to review the third tab of the provided ledger. During the aggressive forensic audit of Evelyn Lawson's international money laundering operation, my intelligence contractors had not merely found a single bank account. They had uncovered a secondary, deeply hidden layer of offshore shell companies. These specific accounts were not registered to Gerald or Evelyn. They were registered exclusively to Brad Lawson. Jonathan methodically laid out the undeniable documented proof. Exactly 6 months prior to the wedding, while Brad was aggressively pressuring Camille to sign the prenup to protect his supposed limited startup capital, he had actively and secretly wired $4.2 million into an untraceable banking account in the Cayman Islands. He had deliberately, maliciously excluded this massive fortune from the mandatory financial disclosure documents legally required to validate the prenuptial agreement. He had routed his early venture capital seed money through this dark channel, deliberately starving his own household of resources while constantly demanding Camille adhere to a strict, humiliating budget. The legal mechanism Jonathan invoked was immediate and absolute. By intentionally concealing over $4 million in offshore assets, Brad had committed textbook fraudulent inducement. Jonathan formally requested that the presiding judge strike the entire contract from the record immediately. The judge scrutinized the certified international banking documents, her expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial fury. She looked up from the ledger, glaring directly at the video monitor. She slammed her wooden gavel down onto the sounding block, firmly declaring that the intentional financial deception completely invalidated the entire agreement. She ruled the prenup null and void, entirely unenforceable under the law. The cruel smirk vanished from Brad's face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The heavy steel chains rattled violently through the courtroom speakers as he lunged forward in his metal chair, screaming frantically at his lawyer to fix it, demanding that he file an immediate federal appeal. The armed bailiff in the holding room firmly shoved him back down by his shoulders, ordering him to remain seated and silent. With the prenuptial agreement legally destroyed, the judge announced that the dissolution of the marriage would immediately default to standard equitable distribution laws. She formally decreed that Camille was legally entitled to exactly 50% of the entire marital estate. Brad's defense attorney scrambled to salvage the catastrophic situation. He desperately argued that a 50% division of Brad's total assets still represented a massive multi-million-dollar fortune. He loudly cited the previous high valuations of Brad's tech startup and his vested equity in the Lawson family restaurant holding company, demanding that Camille be forced to liquidate her own personal assets to balance the financial scale. This was the precise moment Jonathan Pierce executed the final fatal maneuver. He stepped forward again, producing a secondary, freshly certified financial valuation report bearing the seals of 3 independent federal auditors. Jonathan systematically dismantled the illusion of Brad's wealth for the permanent court record. He provided verified documentation proving that the tech startup was completely bankrupt, its intellectual property entirely seized by corporate creditors to cover massive defaulted commercial loans. He presented federal indictments proving that the Lawson Restaurant Group shares were currently valued at exactly $0, completely paralyzed by the ongoing federal money laundering and racketeering investigations against Gerald and Evelyn Lawson. But the absolute crushing blow came from the criminal courts. Jonathan detailed the severe financial consequences of Brad's unhinged actions on the tarmac. The Federal Aviation Administration had levied catastrophic fines for the unauthorized attempted launch of a repossessed aircraft. The county tactical units had billed his estate for the emergency deployment on the runway. Because Brad was facing federal felony kidnapping charges and severe extortion indictments, the federal courts had placed a comprehensive, inescapable lien on every single liquid asset he possessed. Jonathan smoothly explained the brilliant, devastating reality of the legal mathematics. Brad's total net worth was no longer measured in millions of dollars of equity. It was a staggering negative balance of $8 million in pure, non-dischargeable criminal restitution debt. The judge finalized the binding decree. By legally awarding Camille 50% of the marital assets, the court allowed Jonathan to strategically bifurcate the estate. Camille was granted full sole physical and legal custody of Lily, alongside the clear title to the primary family residence, completely shielded from Brad's criminality. Brad was officially awarded his 50% share of the remaining business assets. Because the only remaining assets were massive federally mandated financial penalties, Brad's entire share consisted exclusively of crushing insurmountable criminal debt. He could not declare bankruptcy on federal restitution. He could not appeal the mathematics. He was permanently financially ruined. I watched the video monitor as the reality of his total destruction finally registered in Brad's hollow eyes. He sat in his cold concrete cell, permanently stripped of his wife, his daughter, his freedom, and his family dynasty, drowning in a mountain of debt he would spend the rest of his miserable life failing to repay. He had tried to leave Camille with absolutely nothing, and in the end, nothing was exactly what he was condemned to keep. The heavy steel-reinforced doors of the county jail cell clanged shut, plunging Brad Lawson into a cold, suffocating reality. Yet the sheer magnitude of his financial and personal destruction refused to fully penetrate his deeply ingrained arrogance. Denial is a remarkably powerful narcotic for men who have spent their entire lives insulated by immense generational wealth. Within 48 hours of his catastrophic defeat in family court, Brad's initial panic mutated into a venomous, calculating resolve. He genuinely believed that the crushing $8 million penalty was merely a temporary bureaucratic hurdle. He had spent his entire professional career within the aggressive, unregulated ecosystem of Silicon Valley tech startups, where massive financial failures were routinely washed away by strategic corporate restructuring. He assumed the standard rules of financial evasion still applied to him. He assumed he could simply utilize the federal bankruptcy courts to wipe his slate entirely clean, discharge the massive fines, and emerge a few years later, ready to rebuild his life free from the burden of Camille and his daughter. He summoned Stephen Hayes to the detention center visitor booth, frantically ordering the lawyer to draft an immediate expedited Chapter 7 bankruptcy petition. Brad's strategy was brutally cynical and entirely predictable. He planned to legally declare himself completely destitute, legally classifying the enormous Federal Aviation Administration fines, the private aircraft repossession fees, and the county tactical police deployment costs as standard dischargeable civil liabilities. He believed he could legally force the government and the aviation authorities to absorb the financial damages of his aborted kidnapping attempt. He intended to walk into the federal bankruptcy court, play the role of a financially ruined, mentally exhausted entrepreneur, and walk out legally absolved of the $8 million anchor currently dragging him straight to the bottom of the ocean. 2 weeks later, Brad appeared via remote video link before a federal bankruptcy judge. He wore his bright orange detention uniform, but he sat with his shoulders squared and his chin raised, projecting the arrogant aura of a man who believed he had outsmarted the entire judicial system. Stephen Hayes stood at the lectern in the courtroom, passionately delivering a highly technical, aggressively worded petition. He argued that the fines levied against his client were administrative penalties tied to corporate charter regulations and municipal civil codes. He deliberately attempted to separate the financial costs of the runway confrontation from the actual criminal act of kidnapping. Hayes formally requested that the judge issue an immediate discharge of all debts, wiping Brad's financial record completely clean and allowing him to face his impending criminal trial without the crushing weight of permanent insolvency. Brad smirked at the camera, a cold, triumphant expression settling over his pale features. He honestly believed he had found the ultimate loophole. He did not realize that I had anticipated this exact maneuver the very moment the police locked the handcuffs around his wrists on the tarmac. I sat quietly in the back row of the federal bankruptcy courtroom, my posture perfectly rigid, my expression entirely blank. I did not interject. I did not voice my outrage at Brad's blatant attempt to manipulate the court. I simply watched Jonathan Pierce step forward to the prosecution's table. Jonathan was not there to argue the moral depravity of Brad's actions. He was there to deliver the final, inescapable lock on Brad's financial cage. Jonathan addressed the federal judge with a calm, surgical precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not utilize theatrical pacing. He simply opened a thin black leather folder and submitted a certified, federally stamped dossier directly to the bench. Jonathan explained that my legal team had not spent the last 2 weeks waiting for the bankruptcy hearing. Instead, we had worked directly and aggressively with the United States Department of Justice, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the county prosecutor's office to formally consolidate every single dollar of Brad's liabilities. Jonathan systematically detailed the exact nature of the legal trap we had constructed. We had not allowed the fines to remain classified as standard civil penalties or corporate administrative fees. Through intense legal lobbying and the presentation of undeniable forensic evidence, Jonathan had successfully petitioned the federal prosecutors to reclassify the entire $8 million sum under the Mandatory Victims Restitution Act. Every single cent of the police deployment, the aircraft grounding, and the federal aviation penalties had been legally permanently tethered to the foundational felony charge of interstate kidnapping. Jonathan looked directly at the video monitor, ensuring Brad heard every single syllable of the legal reality. He stated clearly for the official record that under standard federal bankruptcy code, specifically Section 523, a debtor is permanently irrevocably prohibited from discharging any debt that constitutes criminal restitution. The debt was not a civil disagreement. It was a direct, legally codified financial punishment for a violent felony. It was absolutely immune to bankruptcy. It was immune to corporate restructuring. It was entirely immune to the high-priced legal gymnastics Stephen Hayes was attempting to perform. The federal bankruptcy judge reviewed the certified documents provided by the Department of Justice. The legal precedent was absolute and entirely undeniable. The judge looked up from the bench, glaring fiercely at the video monitor. He struck his gavel with a sharp, resounding crack, immediately and permanently denying the bankruptcy petition. The judge formally declared that the $8 million debt was non-dischargeable criminal restitution. The judge did not stop there. He meticulously detailed the permanent, suffocating reality of Brad's future. He informed the prisoner that this debt would follow him until the day he died. If Brad earned a few cents an hour working in the prison laundry room, the federal government would automatically garnish those wages to pay the restitution. If Brad ever managed to secure parole decades from now, his future wages would be relentlessly garnished. He would never be legally permitted to own a home, register a vehicle, or open a standard line of credit. Any future inheritance, any hidden asset, and any future income would be immediately seized by federal authorities. Brad was not just facing a lengthy prison sentence. He was facing a lifetime of guaranteed, inescapable poverty. He would spend the rest of his natural life as an indentured servant to the state and to the victims of his crimes. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from Brad's face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, suffocating horror. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His chest heaved as he frantically looked at his lawyer, realizing that Stephen Hayes was entirely powerless to stop the federal mandate. The heavy steel chains rattled loudly through the courtroom speakers as Brad buried his face in his shackled hands, finally comprehending the absolute permanence of his destruction. He was utterly, irreversibly broken. With Brad permanently neutralized and locked away in a concrete cell, the focus of my operation shifted entirely to the crumbling remnants of the Lawson Empire. The shockwaves of my forensic audits and the subsequent federal raids had completely decimated their generational power structure. Evelyn Lawson, the ruthless architect of their dark money network, was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility, completely denied bail due to her documented attempts to hire contract killers. Her untraceable offshore accounts were permanently frozen by international banking regulators, completely starving the family of their vital lifeblood. The expensive, highly connected defense attorneys who had protected the Lawsons for decades abruptly withdrew their legal counsel, refusing to work for a family that could no longer cover their massive hourly retainers. Gerald Lawson found himself completely isolated in a sterile, heavily guarded wing of the county detention center. He was facing a mountain of federal weapons charges, severe corporate extortion indictments, and a litany of financial fraud allegations. The sprawling restaurant empire he had inherited and aggressively expanded was currently in the hands of court-appointed receivers, actively being liquidated to pay off the massive commercial debts he had accumulated. The elite country club friends who had once eagerly attended his lavish social events now publicly distanced themselves, treating the Lawson name like a highly contagious disease. Gerald was completely stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his artificial superiority. The profound, suffocating isolation broke the patriarch far faster than the legal threats. Gerald spent his days pacing his small cell, realizing that the aggressive, intimidating tactics that had defined his entire life were now completely useless. He could not scream his way out of federal indictments. He could not bribe federal prosecutors with money he no longer possessed. He recognized with absolute terrifying clarity that the quiet retired plumber he had openly mocked and actively tried to destroy was the sole architect of his total annihilation. I held the absolute power to dictate the remaining years of his life. Late on a Tuesday evening, a highly unusual, heavily encrypted message bypassed my standard security filters and landed directly in Jonathan Pierce's private inbox. It was not sent by a high-powered corporate lawyer or an aggressive crisis manager. It was a formal, desperately worded request transmitted by a severely overworked court-appointed public defender who had been assigned to Gerald Lawson's sinking criminal case. The message lacked the typical legal posturing and aggressive demands. It was a direct, unfiltered plea from a completely broken man. Gerald Lawson was begging for a face-to-face meeting with me in the secure visitation room of the county detention center. He explicitly stated that he was fully prepared to bypass his own legal counsel to negotiate a comprehensive plea deal directly with my trust. He promised to voluntarily surrender the remaining deeply hidden proprietary secrets of his corporate empire, offering to expose a widespread network of corrupt city officials and complicit real estate developers. He was desperately willing to trade the absolute destruction of his elite social circle and potentially turn state's evidence against his own wife in exchange for a single ounce of mercy regarding his impending federal sentence. The man who had once demanded I surrender my granddaughter was now begging on his knees for a meeting. The drive to the county detention center took me far beyond the polished commercial districts and wealthy suburban enclaves where the Lawson family had once wielded their absolute authority. The facility sat on a barren stretch of industrial wasteland, a monolithic structure of reinforced concrete razor wire and harsh, unblinking floodlights. I parked my vehicle and walked through the heavy steel security doors, leaving the crisp afternoon air behind for an atmosphere thick with the smell of industrial bleach and institutional despair. I did not bring Jonathan Pierce with me. I did not bring a briefcase filled with legal documents or financial ledgers. I brought absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of reality walking through the sterile corridors with the quiet, measured pace of a man who had completely finished the war. The visitation room was a long, narrow corridor divided entirely by a wall of thick, smudged, bulletproof glass. The lighting overhead buzzed with a low, erratic electrical hum, casting a sickly pale glow over the row of bolted metal stools. I sat down at booth number 7, resting my hands calmly on the scratched steel counter. I waited in absolute silence. 3 minutes later, a heavy iron door on the opposite side of the glass clanged open. A county bailiff escorted Gerald Lawson into the booth. The physical deterioration of the former patriarch was staggering. The imposing, tailored country club executive who had stood on a private tarmac and threatened to murder me was completely gone. Gerald was swimming in an oversized, faded orange inmate uniform, his shoulders severely slumped, his posture completely hollowed out by the crushing isolation of his maximum security cell. His face was deeply lined, his skin pale and sallow, his manicured hair completely unkempt. The massive federal weapons charges, the corporate extortion indictments, and the catastrophic collapse of his generational empire had aged him 20 years in a matter of weeks. He sat down heavily on the metal stool, his trembling hands reaching for the black plastic telephone receiver mounted to the wall. I picked up my receiver, holding it to my ear. I did not speak. I simply stared through the thick glass, forcing Gerald to bridge the agonizing silence. Gerald's voice filtered through the earpiece, raspy and weak, stripped of every single ounce of the arrogant superiority he had utilized his entire life. He did not lead with a threat or a blustering demand. He immediately began to beg. He looked at me with sunken, bloodshot eyes, his voice breaking as he admitted that his family was completely destroyed. He acknowledged that his wife Evelyn was facing federal hitman charges with zero possibility of bail, and his son Brad was permanently locked in a cycle of insurmountable criminal restitution. He admitted total, unequivocal defeat. But true to the deeply ingrained nature of an old money predator, Gerald could not simply accept his consequences. He desperately needed to believe he could still orchestrate a transaction. He needed to believe he still possessed a final golden parachute to buy his way out of absolute ruin. Gerald leaned closer to the smudged glass, lowering his voice as if attempting to conceal a masterful corporate secret from the surrounding guards. He laid out his final desperate pitch. He told me that despite the massive forensic audits and the aggressive receivership liquidating his restaurant empire, there was one single massive asset my legal team had entirely missed. He spoke of the original Lawson family legacy estate, a massive, pristine tract of prime, undeveloped commercial zoning land located on the most lucrative waterfront edge of the county. He claimed the land had been quietly transferred into a blind, irrevocable trust decades ago by his grandfather, completely shielding it from his current personal liability and the immediate federal asset freezes. He stated that the land was currently valued at well over $12 million on the open commercial market. He offered to execute an immediate legally binding transfer of the deed directly to my private real estate portfolio. He promised to hand over the generational crown jewel of the Lawson family, the very soil that established their power free and clear of any legal contest. In exchange, Gerald laid out his demands. He wanted me to immediately drop the crippling civil damages lawsuits my trust had filed against him. More importantly, he begged me to leverage my considerable standing with the federal prosecutors to secure him a highly lenient plea deal, allowing him to serve his impending sentence in a minimum security white-collar facility rather than a violent federal penitentiary. He held his breath, staring at me with desperate, pleading eyes, fully expecting me to eagerly accept the lucrative real estate acquisition. I did not raise my voice. I did not express anger at his blatant attempt to bribe his way out of federal prison. I simply looked at the broken man through the thick glass and systematically dismantled his final illusion. I spoke with a calm, surgical precision, ensuring my voice remained perfectly level through the plastic receiver. I informed Gerald that my intelligence contractors had absolutely not missed the legacy waterfront property. We had comprehensively mapped the entire Lawson asset portfolio weeks before the federal authorities even executed their initial raids. I explained that Gerald had profoundly misunderstood the severity of his own financial mismanagement. During his aggressive, reckless expansion of the restaurant group 5 years ago, he had quietly leveraged that exact blind trust. He had used the waterfront land as hidden secondary collateral to secure a massive commercial loan to cover his failing operational costs. I watched the color completely drain from Gerald's pale face as I delivered the final, undeniable mathematical reality. The commercial bank holding that primary note had panicked the moment the federal government indicted him for racketeering. The bank had instantly called the loan accelerating the debt collection. Because his liquid assets were entirely frozen, the bank had legally executed the collateral clause. I calmly informed Gerald that 48 hours ago the commercial lenders had filed an expedited emergency foreclosure on the waterfront legacy land. The property was currently in the hands of the bank's liquidation department. The deed he was attempting to barter was completely worthless paper. He owned absolutely nothing. I told him clearly that I would not drop a single civil lawsuit. I would not utilize my influence to secure him a comfortable plea deal, and I would absolutely not speak to the federal prosecutors except to formally demand the absolute maximum sentence allowed under the law. I explained that he had brought this total destruction upon himself the exact moment he allowed his son to terrorize my daughter and use my granddaughter as a pawn. I told him the transaction was permanently closed, and he was completely out of capital. Gerald Lawson's mouth opened, but no sound came through the receiver. His trembling hands dropped the heavy plastic phone, letting it dangle by its metal cord, hitting the steel counter with a dull, hollow thud. He slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the cold, bulletproof glass, his chest heaving, as the absolute crushing permanence of his situation finally settled into his bones. He had no hidden wealth. He had no leverage. He had absolutely nothing left to trade. I did not stay to watch him weep. I simply stood up from the metal stool, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked away from the booth, leaving him completely alone in his concrete cage. The heavy steel doors of the visitation center clicked shut behind me as I stepped back out into the crisp, bright afternoon air. The Shadow War was officially over and the consequences were absolutely set in stone. The criminal sentencing dates were rapidly approaching on the federal docket, casting a long, inescapable shadow over the remnants of the Lawson dynasty. Evelyn was facing consecutive life sentences for attempting to hire contract killers. Brad was staring down decades in federal prison while permanently chained to $8 million of non-dischargeable criminal debt. And Gerald, completely stripped of his empire and his legacy, was heading toward a maximum security penitentiary with absolutely no hope of a comfortable reprieve. They had spent their entire lives believing their wealth made them untouchable gods among men. Now, as the heavy gears of the federal justice system ground forward with merciless precision, they simultaneously realized the most terrifying truth of all. The walls were rapidly closing in, the doors were permanently locked, and there was absolutely no way out. Camille stared down at the heavy titanium key resting in her palm. The polished metal was cold, yet it felt as though it were burning through her skin. She did not look out at the sprawling city skyline or the blinking data monitors tracking global markets across the penthouse command center. Her eyes remained locked on the small object that held the power to dismantle corporate empires, freeze international bank accounts, and completely ruin lives. She slowly closed her hand, her knuckles turning white under the fluorescent lights, and looked back up at me. The absolute unbreakable resolve she had carried out of the federal courthouse just an hour ago was entirely gone, replaced by a sudden suffocating terror. She admitted, her voice trembling slightly, that she was terrified of the key. She had spent the last 7 years trapped inside the Lawson family ecosystem, watching firsthand how immense unchecked wealth operated like a terminal consuming disease. She had seen how it mutated Gerald from a standard businessman into a ruthless tyrant, and how it had completely stripped Evelyn of every single shred of human empathy. Camille told me she was terrified that holding this level of institutional power would inevitably change her. She feared that the billions of dollars in offshore accounts and the capacity to command elite intelligence contractors would slowly erode her morality. She was terrified that one day, years from now, she would look in the mirror and see Evelyn Lawson staring back. Most of all, she feared infecting Lily with the same toxic, unearned entitlement that had permanently destroyed Brad. I did not offer her empty platitudes or tell her that she was inherently better than the people who had tortured her. I simply reached out, took the titanium key from her hand, and placed it securely in my coat pocket. I instructed her to follow me. We left the sterile high-tech command center and rode the private elevator down to the subterranean parking garage. I dismissed my corporate security detail and took the keys to a standard unmarked sedan. I drove us away from the glittering financial district, navigating through the heavy afternoon traffic, leaving the glass skyscrapers and the corporate authority far behind us. We drove for 40 minutes until the landscape completely shifted. The towering corporate headquarters were replaced by narrow, cracked streets lined with modest single-story homes and aging brick storefronts. It was a working-class neighborhood entirely disconnected from the wealth and extreme influence of the inner city. I parked the sedan across the street from a small, weathered plumbing supply store. The faded paint on the wooden sign was peeling, and a battered, rusted service van was parked in the narrow gravel driveway. I pointed to the worn brick building and told Camille that this was exactly where my empire had begun. Long before I acquired offshore banking channels, commercial high-rises, and international intelligence contractors, I spent 14 hours a day underneath leaking sinks and inside flooded basements. I explained that the Lawsons had inherited their wealth, assuming it was a divine right that permanently elevated them above the rest of humanity. They wielded their money entirely as a sword, constantly swinging it to sever the knees of anyone standing in their way, demanding absolute submission from a world they falsely believed they owned. I told Camille that she had to view this trust not as a weapon of domination, but exclusively as a shield. The titanium key was not a license to conquer. It was a hardened perimeter designed to protect the people she loved from the monsters who believed they were untouchable. I reminded her of the intense daily discipline it required for me to live a completely invisible life. I possessed the financial capacity to absolutely crush Brad Lawson the very first time he raised his voice to her. But using power impulsively is the quickest, most direct route to corruption. True wealth is possessing the absolute capacity for total destruction and simultaneously possessing the unbreakable discipline to keep that weapon holstered until it is the absolute last remaining option for survival. Camille looked out the passenger window, staring intently at the rusted plumbing van. I told her that her genuine fear of the key was the exact reason she was the only person qualified to hold it. The Lawsons never feared their power. They reveled in it, and that deep arrogance blinded them to the reality of their own vulnerability. Fear is a necessary anchor. It prevents the human ego from detaching from reality. I explained that she had survived the darkest, most manipulative depths of predatory wealth without surrendering her compassion or her sanity. She had endured poverty, isolation, and severe emotional abuse, and she had fought entirely to protect her daughter, never to acquire status or inflict unnecessary pain. Wealth acts as a permanent amplifier. If a person is empty inside, immense wealth amplifies that emptiness into cruelty. If a person is grounded by severe hardship, wealth amplifies their capacity to protect. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved the titanium key, and held it out to her a second time. I told her that the money would not corrupt her, because her character had already been tested in a crucible far hotter than anything the corporate world could ever manufacture. She did not just survive the fire, she had completely mastered it. Camille reached out and took the key. Her hand was no longer trembling. The fear in her eyes had hardened into a calm, profound understanding of the monumental burden she was accepting. She did not put the key in her purse. She slid it into the inner pocket of her suit jacket, pressing it close to her chest. She nodded silently, accepting the absolute transfer of power. The Shadow War was over, and the Empire was now under the command of a woman who understood exactly what it meant to fight from the bottom. I started the engine, and we drove away from the old neighborhood, heading back toward the life she had fought so fiercely to secure. The atmosphere inside our fortified property exactly 1 week later stood in absolute joyous contrast to the suffocating terror that had consumed our lives a year prior. The heavy titanium shutters remained raised, allowing the bright afternoon sunlight to completely flood the expansive living room. The thick ballistic glass windows offered a clear, unobstructed view of the sprawling backyard, where the green lawn was decorated with bright balloons, colorful streamers, and a massive inflatable castle. We were preparing for Lily's 8th birthday party. There were no elite security contractors sweeping the perimeter, no encrypted communication channels monitoring offshore wire transfers, and no looming threats of federal lawsuits. The air was filled with the sound of cheerful music and the chaotic, happy laughter of children. Camille stood in the kitchen, carefully arranging a row of candles on a large chocolate cake. She wore a simple, comfortable dress, her posture completely relaxed. The dark circles under her eyes had vanished, and the constant, rigid tension she used to carry in her shoulders was entirely gone. I watched my daughter smile as Lily ran through the back door wearing a bright pink party hat and carrying a handful of ribbons. Lily chased a group of her school friends back out into the yard, her laughter ringing clearly through the open patio doors. Just 12 months prior, we were locked in a desperate high-stakes battle for survival against a family that possessed the resources to legally kidnap this child. We had faced contract killers, elite corporate lawyers, and a corrupt social dynasty that believed they could erase us with complete impunity. We had systematically dismantled their empire, seized their assets, and locked them in federal penitentiaries. We had utilized every single weapon in my hidden arsenal to ensure that they could never cast a shadow over this house again. Camille struck a match, carefully lighting the 8th candle on the cake. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine across the kitchen island. There was a quiet, unshakable strength in her gaze. She was the sole director of an international financial trust, holding the power to manipulate global markets. Yet her entire focus was centered firmly on the small flickering flames in front of her. She picked up the cake, walked out onto the sunlit patio, and called out to her daughter. The guests gathered around, singing in a loud, joyous chorus. As Lily closed her eyes and took a deep breath to blow out the candles, I stepped back into the quiet of the house. The perimeter was secure. The legacy was protected. The war was definitively won, and for the first time in a very long time, I finally allowed myself to rest. The smoke from the 8 extinguished candles curled upward toward the kitchen ceiling, carrying with it the heavy, sweet scent of melted wax and rich chocolate. The room instantly erupted into genuine, unfiltered applause. There were no polite golf claps from wealthy tech investors seeking venture capital. There were no forced smiles from country club socialites judging the thread count of the tablecloths. The guests standing in my kitchen and spilling out onto the sunlit patio were simply parents from Lily's school, a few trusted neighbors, and several men from my old plumbing crew who had known Camille since she was a toddler. It was a crowd completely devoid of strategic value, which made it the most valuable gathering I had ever hosted. Camille skillfully removed the candles and began slicing the thick chocolate cake. She handed the first comically large piece directly to Lily, who accepted it with both hands and a brilliant frosting-stained grin. I leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen, sipping a cup of black coffee, watching my daughter operate without a single ounce of fear. Exactly 1 year ago, Brad Lawson had completely hijacked Lily's 7th birthday. He had rented an exclusive, obnoxiously expensive downtown venue, treating the event as a networking opportunity for his doomed startup. He had ignored his own daughter entirely, leaving Camille to manage the frantic chaos while he drank expensive scotch with potential investors. He had berated Camille in front of the caterers for buying the wrong brand of sparkling water. The memory of that sharp, humiliating tension felt like a lifetime ago. Today, the only tension in the air came from a fierce, highly competitive game of tag developing around the inflatable castle in the backyard. Camille moved through the crowd, handing out paper plates and pouring juice, her laughter ringing out clear and unrestrained. She did not flinch when a neighbor bumped into her shoulder. She did not constantly scan the room waiting for a cruel, whispered reprimand. She was finally entirely free. Lily ran up to me, balancing her heavy plate of cake. She bumped against my leg, looking up with wide, joyful eyes. She thanked me for the party and immediately asked if I wanted to help her test the new telescope I had assembled for her that morning. I set my coffee mug on the counter, knelt down to her eye level, and promised her we would map every single visible constellation the exact second the sun went down. She beamed, turned on her heel, and sprinted back toward the grass, shouting for her friends to follow. Camille walked over, holding 2 plates of cake. She handed one to me and leaned against the doorframe by my side. She watched the children running across the lawn, the bright afternoon sun illuminating the vibrant colors of the party decorations. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a profound, unshakable peace. She told me she could finally breathe. She said that for 7 years, every single joyous moment had been immediately poisoned by a deep, looming dread, a constant, sickening anticipation of the inevitable punishment Brad would inflict the moment the guests left. She looked at the heavy titanium shutters retracted cleanly above the windows and the reinforced security doors standing wide open to the summer breeze. She noted the irony. We were standing inside a military-grade fortress surrounded by ballistic glass and pneumatic locks, yet she had never felt so completely unburdened and free in her entire life. I took a bite of the cake, the rich chocolate grounding me in the present moment. I told my daughter that true security is never about the thickness of the steel in the walls. It is entirely about the quality of the people standing inside the perimeter. The Lawsons had built sprawling estates gated by wrought iron and funded by offshore millions, but their homes were cold, sterile prisons entirely defined by paranoia, greed, and the constant suffocating need to dominate. We had built a sanctuary. The fortifications protecting this house were merely tools to keep the monsters at bay while the real life happened inside. The afternoon bled smoothly into the early evening. The intense summer heat broke, giving way to a cool, comforting breeze. The parents began to gather their exhausted, happy children, offering warm, genuine hugs to Camille as they departed. There were no strategic goodbyes, no promises of future business meetings, just honest gratitude for a simple, perfect afternoon. I helped Camille gather the empty plates and sweep the wrapping paper from the living room floor. The house slowly quieted down, returning to a state of absolute tranquil calm. Lily was already upstairs, thoroughly exhausted and preparing for bed, eagerly waiting for the sky to darken so we could test her new telescope. As I tied off the heavy plastic garbage bag in the kitchen, I felt a sharp, singular vibration against my ribs. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and extracted my secured, encrypted mobile device. The screen illuminated with a direct, high-priority alert from Jonathan Pierce. I excused myself, stepping away from the kitchen and walking down the quiet hallway into my private, soundproofed home office. I closed the solid oak door behind me, engaging the mechanical lock, and opened the encrypted application. The message from Jonathan was concise, heavily documented, and entirely final. The federal receivership assigned to liquidate the remnants of the Lawson Empire had officially concluded their primary asset distribution. Gerald Lawson's massive commercial debts and Brad's insurmountable criminal restitution had completely drained the family's domestic accounts. To satisfy the remaining federal liens, the government had forcefully seized the ultimate crown jewel of their dynasty. The sprawling, opulent Lawson estate, the massive mansion where Evelyn had confidently ordered my assassination and Gerald had reigned supreme over his corrupt social circle, had been placed on the commercial auction block. Jonathan provided the certified, digitally stamped deed of transfer. The estate had not been purchased by a rival restaurant conglomerate or a wealthy country club associate. It had been acquired in a closed-door, all-cash transaction by a newly formed, heavily shielded holding company. That holding company was entirely owned and operated by my private trust. I scrolled through the attached files, examining the digital photographs Jonathan had captured just an hour ago. The massive wrought iron gates bearing the Lawson family crest had been unceremoniously ripped from their stone pillars by heavy construction equipment. A fleet of commercial demolition vehicles was currently parked on the pristine, manicured front lawn, tearing deep, muddy tracks into the expensive grass. I had not purchased the estate to live in it. I had not purchased it to flip it for a commercial profit. I had purchased it to completely eradicate the physical manifestation of their arrogance. Jonathan's report detailed the aggressive immediate renovations currently underway. The elite architectural team I had retained was already inside the mansion, systematically destroying the opulent gilded interior. They were tearing down the imported crystal chandeliers, smashing the custom marble flooring, and gutting the grand dining room where the Lawsons had sat and calculated the destruction of innocent lives. The sprawling master suites and luxury entertainment wings were being rapidly converted into dozens of secure, comfortable individual living quarters. The massive subterranean wine cellar was being retrofitted into a secure, state-of-the-art legal clinic and psychological counseling center. I looked at the final digital document in the file. It was the newly minted, legally binding municipal zoning permit. The property had been officially reclassified from a private residential estate to a fully funded, highly secure nonprofit commercial facility. The permit bore the new permanent name of the property. It was now officially registered as the Sylvia Wright Shelter for Financially Abused Women. I named it after my late wife, a woman who possessed more genuine grace and quiet strength in a single breath than the entire Lawson bloodline possessed in their entire history. The mansion that had served as the ultimate monument to the Lawsons' greed, cruelty, and unearned superiority was now permanently dedicated to protecting housing and legally defending the exact type of vulnerable women that Brad and Gerald had spent their lives terrorizing. Every single time Gerald, Evelyn, or Brad attempted to look up their grand family legacy from the cold concrete confines of their federal prison cells, they would see a thriving sanctuary providing absolute safety to their victims. They had weaponized their wealth to inflict pain. I had weaponized mine to manufacture permanent, undeniable justice. I locked the encrypted device and slid it back into my jacket pocket. The screen went entirely black, cutting off the glow in the quiet office. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive triumph. I did not smile. I simply felt the deep, profound satisfaction of a heavily burdened scale permanently clicking into perfect balance. The equation was finally solved. The debt was entirely collected. I unlocked the heavy oak door and walked back out into the brightly lit hallway of my home. I could hear Camille upstairs softly singing a familiar lullaby as she tucked Lily into bed. The sound of her voice was clear, strong, and completely devoid of fear. I walked up the stairs, leaving the darkness of the Shadow War permanently behind me, completely ready to map the stars with my granddaughter. True power is never measured by the ability to dominate, manipulate, or instill fear in others. It is defined by the unwavering discipline to use strength exclusively as a shield for the vulnerable. Wealth acts as a relentless amplifier of human character. When placed in the hands of the arrogant, it breeds cruelty and destruction. However, when guided by morality, patience, and the memory of hardship, resources can dismantle corrupt empires and construct sanctuaries in their ashes. Setting absolute boundaries and refusing to negotiate with abusers is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and justice. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below on how you would handle such a toxic family dynamic.